Hey there. If you're new, welcome to the channel. If you're a regular, welcome back. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Let me know in the comments. Now, sit back, relax, and let the stories begin. Years ago, when cell phones weren't as common, I was in my early 30s, a mom with 2 young kids, on the way to the pediatrician's office. The Macon Guard doctor's office was located an hour away from our house, and I had brought my 2 youngest, then just 1 and 3 years old, for their appointment. Since we lived so far from the office, they always scheduled us for the last slot of the day, which was incredibly helpful. The doctor had just moved into a new building off a newly built stretch of highway, so the area was quite remote, surrounded by nothing but open space, though the facility itself was far nicer than his previous office near the hospital. His new office was set far back from the main road, and by the time we arrived, my black Jeep Cherokee, which we'd owned for about 2 years, was one of only a handful of cars in the parking lot. I parked near the entrance, got the kids out of their car seats, and we spent the next hour or so waiting, seeing the doctor, paying for the visit, and then heading back outside. After buckling the kids into their seats, I noticed the receptionist locking the doors, and when I tried to start the car, it wouldn't turn over. I quickly grabbed the kids again, knocked on the door, and asked to use the phone to call a local garage. The man on the other end said someone would be over shortly, but it could take a little while. I gave him my location, then returned to the car, rolled down the windows, and got the kids settled back in as we waited. Soon, the lights in the building were turned off, and the parking lot was empty, leaving us all alone. With still some daylight left, I spent that time trying to keep the kids calm, looking through the car for snacks, checking to make sure they weren't getting too hot, and generally trying to keep them comfortable. I was relieved when a truck soon pulled into the lot, and a man got out, gave me a polite nod, and told me he'd take a look under the hood. He looked like a middle-aged, somewhat scruffy gas station attendant. Nothing out of the ordinary, especially late in the day, and I was just thankful when he immediately began working on the car. I stayed in the driver's seat with the door open, waiting for him to signal me to try starting the car, but he seemed to be taking a long time, fiddling with various things under the hood. I had hoped he would just grab jumper cables, but he didn't. From my seat, I asked him what he thought the issue was, and he said it was just some loose wires, not the battery, and continued working. I couldn't see his face, but his hands were visible through the gap between the windshield and the raised hood. Several times, he mentioned that the wires were loose and if I could come over, he'd show me which one it was so it wouldn't happen again. I laughed it off, telling him that I didn't know anything about cars and didn't need him to show me anything. I thanked him and stayed where I was, still waiting for him to tell me to try starting the car. At one point, I thought he might have been flirting with me, but I focused on being polite and patient, since he was helping us. We were hot, tired, and a little miserable, and most of my attention was on the kids. But oddly, he seemed to grow frustrated that I wouldn't come closer to look at the engine. I started to feel uneasy, worried that he might get so upset he would leave us stranded with the sun setting so quickly. Then, just as suddenly as he'd arrived, something strange happened. Another truck pulled into the empty parking lot, and the man working on my car quickly slammed the hood shut, ran to his truck, started it up, and drove off without a word or any explanation. I was left feeling confused and a bit anxious. I couldn't understand why he left so abruptly, and I was now worried about who had just pulled in. I also felt a surge of fear, realizing I was alone with the kids, vulnerable and without any help. Why didn't he stay and at least speak to whoever had just pulled up next to me? It seemed like the polite thing to do. I looked around, and once again, I realized there was no traffic on the road. No buildings or houses were nearby, and the sun was setting fast. As the new truck parked beside me, I hesitated but got out of the car. The moment I stepped out, the man introduced himself and his name, and his voice sounded like the one I had spoken to on the phone earlier. He even called me by name, apologized for his tardiness, and then, after a moment, asked who the man who had just left was. Relieved and unbothered, I laughed and said, "I don't know. I thought he was you all along." We both chuckled, and then he grabbed jumper cables, walked to the front of the car, raised the hood, and quickly started working on the battery. Grateful that the air conditioning would soon be working again, I slid back into the driver's seat and turned to check on the kids. As I waited to hear the familiar cue to try the engine, I was caught off guard when the man walked over to the driver's side door. In the strangest tone, he asked, "Ma'am, is this yours?" I looked at what he was holding. A long, thin, dagger-like object, about 1.5 feet in length. It looked old, covered in reddish dust, and had tiny finger holes at one end, almost like a cross between a sword and a pair of scissors. I was more intrigued than scared at first and asked where he found it. "Under the hood," he replied. I casually said, "I've never seen anything like that before. It's strange that it's been stuck in my car all this time without me knowing." I even shook my head and smiled at the oddity of it. But he continued to stare at me, his face pale, as if he couldn't find the words to explain. He just held the strange object, staring at it in disbelief. To be honest, I wasn't too concerned. All I wanted was for the car to start, pay the man, and leave. He didn't say anything else, just set the object down on the curb, started his truck, and motioned for me to try the Jeep. When it started right up, my 3-year-old cheered. Relieved, I cranked up the air conditioner, rolled up the windows, and aimed the vents toward the back seat. I reached for my purse to pay him, stood up, and walked toward him to settle the bill. But instead of handing me the amount owed, he walked right past me, picking up that strange object again. "Hey, ma'am," he said slowly, "I want you to look at this one more time," holding it out for closer inspection. I stepped closer, examining the object carefully despite the man's imposing size. It was unnervingly long and thin, almost like a bayonet, except for the small loops at one end. He spoke quietly, as if trying to make sure I understood something that was still unclear to me. "Ma'am, these weren't hidden somewhere in the engine. They weren't there long. In fact, they were sitting right on top. Someone must have just placed them there." I shook my head, still smiling, and replied, "But they're obviously very old and rusty." He pointed more closely at it and nodded, saying, "Yeah, do you see how sharp these are?" he asked, pointing to the object. "They look like they've just been sharpened." When I looked down, I realized he was right. I don't know why I hadn't noticed it earlier, but the sharpness of the blade was far more terrifying than its length. The dagger-like form was unsettling, but the fact that it was so well maintained and sharp was what truly frightened me. As I handed him the payment, he spoke again. "Ma'am, I don't know what was going to happen here, but I'm really glad I showed up when I did." He thanked me quietly, took the payment, and suggested I call the police once I was safely home. Then he asked what I wanted to do with the object. Not wanting to touch it, I rolled down the back window, and he carefully placed it inside the car. We both left the parking lot at the same time. He turned one way, and I turned the other, heading towards the small highway that would lead me home, still an hour away. Once we arrived, I did indeed contact the police, making sure to get the kids inside safely first. The officers listened politely, but when I offered to bring the strange object to them, they declined. The officer on the phone mentioned that based on my description, the item sounded like it could be specialized surgical shears, which was deeply unsettling. I had been careful not to touch any part of it, hoping they might be able to lift fingerprints or test the surface for blood, but they didn't seem interested. The officer simply said I was lucky and suggested I keep the shears for a few days in case someone from their office got back to me. That was the end of it. I wrapped the shears in newspaper and stored them in the brick storage unit behind our house, where they remained untouched for several years. When we finally moved, I threw them out. But here's the chilling part. Around that time, reports were circulating in the local newspapers about women going missing in Georgia, some of whom were never found. Even now, all these years later, it's still happening. I often wonder what might have happened if the service station attendant hadn't shown up when he did. Would my children still have a mother? Would I have missed all those years with my son and daughter? I'll probably never know. But that day taught me something about myself. I always thought I was good at being aware of my surroundings, at reading situations and staying safe. But in that moment, exhausted, hot, stranded in an unfamiliar place, my common sense just left me. I wasn't thinking clearly, and my friends and family still believe that moment could have cost us our lives. I've been working for the United States Forest Service here in Texas for almost 10 years now. I absolutely love my job, and it's rare for anything particularly creepy or unsettling to happen. But after all this time, I've had my share of experiences that might make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. For example, we occasionally get jaguars hunting in the forest here, and they're one terrifying big cat. What makes them particularly scary is how they handle their prey once they've caught it. Picture this. You're walking through the trees on a sunny day when suddenly you catch the scent of something rotten. You look around, but there's nothing there. Just the peaceful green pines and the sound of birds in the air. Then, out of nowhere, something hits the top of your head. It's wet. You reach up, only to feel something cold and slimy running through your hair. You bring your hand down and hope it's just bird droppings. But instead, it's something much worse. It's blood. You look up, and hanging just above you from a tree is the half-eaten, mutilated corpse of an animal. Its guts are torn out, skin shredded, face half-eaten, with missing hooves or paws, and broken bone fragments sticking out of cracked limbs. It seems strange and almost unbelievable, but the jaguar has a reason for doing this. If it doesn't hoist its kill up into the tree, it risks losing its meal to other predators or scavengers on the ground. As creepy as that is, it's nothing compared to the other things I've come across in my time with the Forest Service. One time, I was doing a routine walk through the trails, making sure the signs and markers for tourists were in good shape. There's a large sandstone boulder about 100 meters off the trail, with a shallow cave carved into one side from thousands of years of wind erosion. As I approached, I saw a man standing near the entrance of the cave. At first, I thought he was in camouflage hunting gear. I called out to him, just a casual greeting, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and bolted through the trees. I immediately became concerned about what he might have been doing in the cave. I was worried he had left a body or something there. Fortunately, there wasn't, but there was something strange left behind. I can't say for sure that it was him who left it there. I've often wondered if he stumbled upon it first, saw me, and just panicked. But when I entered the cave and shone my flashlight around, I found something that might explain why he ran so quickly. There was a small patch of dirt, like it had been cleared, and in the middle of it were a bunch of human teeth. I still don't know why they were there, or who left them, or what their purpose was. But I did what I could. I collected the teeth in a plastic bag I had on me, it had held my lunch earlier, and took them to the nearest police station. I gave a description of the man I'd seen running away from the cave. I've had the usual wild animal encounters and heard strange noises at night, but those teeth have always stuck with me. I have no explanation for it, but it certainly makes for one unsettling story. This happened when I was in grade 10 at a high school in Ontario, just under an hour east of Toronto. I'm 30 now, and I've only shared this story with a few people. It's not the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, but it definitely freaked me and my friends out at the time. It all started during lunch hour. I never liked eating in the cafeteria, too crowded, and I didn't like the idea of people watching me eat. I'm not exactly sure why now, but my friends felt the same way. So instead of staying in the cafeteria, we'd either go to one of our houses or find a spot outside near the school to sit, eat, and maybe toss a baseball around afterward. One day, we found a creek behind some backyards. There were a few large rocks that we could use as makeshift seats. It was quiet and secluded, and we thought it would be a perfect place to hang out for an hour. Just to clarify, we weren't trespassing. These backyards were fenced off, and the creek itself was open to anyone walking by, including us. There were 4 of us that day. We ate lunch, joked around, and played catch with a baseball. I stood further into the creek, near some tall trees that probably led into a forest if you kept walking. My friend threw the ball, I missed, and it rolled behind a tree. I walked over to grab it, and that's when I saw her. Sitting upright on the other side of the tree, facing away from me, was what looked like a woman with long, straight black hair. She was completely still. I saw her just before I picked up the ball, and my stomach dropped. I knew I had to stay calm, so I wouldn't spook her or freak myself out more than I already was. I grabbed the ball, quickly walked back, and said, "Guys, let's go. We're going to be late." They all argued that we had time and would be early, but I looked at them with wide eyes, silently trying to communicate, and repeated, "Let's go." They were confused, but they followed me. As we walked away, I kept glancing over my shoulder, making sure we weren't being followed. Once we felt far enough away, I told them what I'd seen. They all believed me because they knew I wouldn't just make something up, especially not to ruin our lunch break. Plus, I hated going back to school early after lunch. Curious as teenage boys are, we returned to the creek a few days later. But the woman wasn't there. Now, in my 30s, I've never experienced anything as unsettling as that moment. It still feels as vivid as if it happened yesterday. Like I said, I've only told this story a handful of times, and it still gives me chills every time I think about it. I always kept the door open just a crack because that room tended to get unbearably hot if I didn't, and she was standing there, outside the room, completely naked, watching me through the open crack in the door. I said her name and asked if she was okay, which seemingly startled her because she walked away pretty sharpish. I convinced myself that, in my over-caffeinated, sleep-deprived state, I'd imagined the whole thing and didn't mention it to anyone. Fast forward around a month, and I head over to my sister's one night to find FR kind of agitated about what he perceives to be a peeping Tom problem. He found fingerprints on the outside of his office window in such a way that would imply someone had been pressing up against the glass and looking in. The blind in this room was slightly too small for the window, so you could see in from the outside if you looked through at the sides. And the room was on the front of the house, and the window was easily accessible from the street. He'd become concerned that some random passing pervert had been spying on him while he was having a private moment, so to speak, in his office, or else some potential burglar had been sizing up the joint. The police were called, but as they didn't have any external CCTV at this point, no evidence could be provided, and ultimately not a lot could be done. To combat this escalating further, FR installed both internal and external CCTV on the house. This was installed whilst WR and WGF were away on a holiday, and I guess everyone just forgot to tell them about it. Another couple of months later, I go to my sister's to find WR's room empty and informed that he has moved out. Of course, I ask why, and I was informed simply that he and WGF were a pair of creeps, and the others had collectively decided to kick them out. Apparently, her watching me through the office door was not a one-time incident. The CCTV footage showed that she regularly made a habit of standing and watching me through the cracked door, sometimes for as long as 20 to 30 minutes. I was just usually asleep when she did it. Not only that, but the fingerprints on the window had quite apparently been from WR standing outside and watching me after I'd showered and was hanging out in just a towel, which was a less regular occurrence, but apparently was caught on camera enough times for it to be concerning. As if this wasn't weird enough in and of itself, I was recently hanging out with my sister and her husband, and he passed a comment about how he wishes that they'd told me the full story at the time so I could have chosen to press charges. I asked what he meant by that, and he revealed that not only had they both been secretly watching me, the CCTV also showed that they'd messed with food and stuff that I bought, including clips of him licking all of my apples, her spitting in my orange juice, even dumping regular cow's milk in my lactose-free stuff, which explained why I had a period of feeling really sick from nowhere. To top it all off, apparently when FR barged into their room to confront them about it, he not only found that several shirts I thought I'd misplaced elsewhere had been stolen by the two of them and literally hung up on their wall. She had done several drawings of me sleeping and written a poem called Ode to Me, whose contents I don't know and don't really want to know. Apparently, FR gave them an ultimatum of, "You have 2 hours to get out of this house and never contact her or me again or any of us, or I'm calling the police," and they took the former option. They've never tried to contact me subsequent to this, but I feel sick thinking of what they were potentially planning. This happened about a year ago. I'm 16 now, and he'll be turning 20 in August. We first met online, and it turned out he lived in the city right next to my village. When I was 12 and he was 16, we quickly lost touch. But after 2 years, I decided to reach out again because my friends had edited a photo of him and dared me to send it to him. He had seemed nice enough back then. We quickly found we had a lot of shared interests, and our conversations felt pretty easy. I was used to age gaps in friendships since I never seemed to meet people my age, so the difference didn't bother me. He came to visit my village a few times, and we got along well, even with my best friend. But then I heard from one of my online friends that he'd had a Skype conversation with her, where he confessed that his last girlfriend supposedly ended her life because of things he'd said to her. My friend began to think he was starting to develop feelings for her, probably because she was kind and compassionate. Another friend voiced her concern for him, which ended their friendship. She was understandably disturbed by his comments. My friends confronted him, and I asked why he hadn't told me the same thing. He told me I was too immature to understand. I was hurt by this response. I had been the one to introduce him to my friend group, and now he was trying to push me out of it. My friends had had enough and cut him off, but I didn't. I felt sorry for him. He was an orphan, living alone, dealing with alcohol issues, and struggling with depression. Losing 3 people must have been hard for him, so I kept messaging him, perhaps out of pity. Over time, he became much creepier. He suddenly started calling me darling. At first, I was thrilled, even though it was just a harmless little crush. It was someone I knew I could never date, but I began to feel like maybe there was hope for me. He spent more time messaging me, sending pictures and videos of himself talking about his day. Nothing out of the ordinary at first. But then one time we were on a call while I was playing a game on my laptop. I don't remember exactly what was said, but I recall him being very excited about the fact that 15 is the legal age in Poland. I felt a little excited too, for some reason. I remember feeling incredibly stiff, even though it was just a phone call. The joke was that we'd meet up in February when I turned 15. I felt like I owed him something because of his mental health struggles. He told me that his psychiatrist had never met someone so young who had gone through so much, even though our conversation hadn't even touched on depression. I felt so bad for him. That's why I never said anything about the things he did that creeped me out or made me feel unsafe, because I was afraid he'd feel worse and do something to himself. He told me that he tried to end his own life a couple of times, so what if it was I that ended up becoming the reason he tried again? He'd already told me about his issues with loneliness and abandonment. When he visited, I learned he still had feelings for his supposed dead ex-girlfriend. He played a song that was their song. Every word in it described their relationship. While we were in my room, he was close to crying, but I had no idea what to do. He put me in this situation even though he knew I wasn't equipped to deal with it. Once, when I was upset, I told him I don't want to be cheered up. I just didn't. I wanted to be alone, so he sent me tons of texts, pictures, and cheap cheer-up lols, things he found on his phone. It was the one time I somewhat sort of created a boundary, and he broke it immediately with a "oops, sorry, too late" message following. I had a school trip in October, and I had a good time from what I remember, but for some reason I just lost all of my feelings for him then and there. Maybe because for once I didn't force myself to feel bad for him and constantly check if he's online, wants to talk, or if something happened. Maybe because all my friends thought we were going to date, and it was really unnerving that they didn't see anything wrong with it. I cut contact with him later very, very slowly. I deleted him off of things he never checks, blocks a number, then blocked him on Facebook. He noticed I never looked back. Later on, through yet another friend, the only one that kept contact with him, I learned that his ex wasn't dead, or maybe she was. There were screenshots of him talking with a family member about the funeral, then screenshots of him talking about moving in with a girl 2 years older than he is, who's the love of his life, who had the same name as his ex. They sent a picture that was supposedly to prove that he was in a psych ward, but even my friend refused to believe him. I didn't even know what he was lying about in the end, or if he was even lying at all. The next school year, I'll be going to school in the city he lives in, and I know he's still out there. The only sound, the of my computer and the ticking of the wall clock. A noise in the hallway made me jump. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching my office. My heart raced as I watched the door handle turn slowly. The door swung open, revealing a man I'd never seen before, tall, well-dressed, with cold eyes that immediately fixed on the necklace at my throat. At last, he said, his voice smooth but menacing. I've been looking for that for a very long time. I stood up, putting the desk between us. Who are you? What do you want? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. My name is Robert, and I want what's mine. He took a step forward, and I edged toward the window. The necklace isn't yours. I bought it fair and square. Robert laughed. A chilling sound. Oh, my dear, nothing about this has been fair. That necklace has a long and bloody history. It's brought nothing but misfortune to its wearers. And now it's time for it to come home. As he spoke, he reached into his jacket. My blood ran cold as he pulled out a gun. Now, he said calmly, I'm going to need you to hand that over. Slowly. My mind raced. The necklace suddenly felt heavy, like it was choking me. With trembling fingers, I reached for the clasp. Just then, the office door burst open again. Karen rushed in, breathless. Sarah, don't. Robert whirled, his gun now trained on Karen. You, he snarled. I should have known you'd show up. Karen's eyes darted between Robert and me. Sarah, listen to me. The necklace is more than just jewelry. It's a key to something powerful and dangerous. That's why he wants it. Robert's face contorted with rage. Shut up, he shouted, his composure cracking. In that moment of distraction, I acted on instinct. I grabbed the heavy paperweight from my desk and hurled it at Robert. It struck his hand, sending the gun clattering to the floor. Karen lunged for the weapon while I ran for the door. I could hear them struggling behind me as I raced down the hallway to the stairs. My feet pounded against the steps as I descended, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I burst out of the building into the cool night air, not daring to look back. I ran without direction, just needing to put distance between myself and what I'd left behind. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I found myself in a small park. I sank onto a bench, my hand instinctively reaching for the necklace. I wanted nothing more than to tear it off and throw it away, but something held me back. Karen's words echoed in my head, a key to something powerful and dangerous. As my breathing slowed, I heard footsteps approaching. I tensed, prepared to flee once again. But it was Karen who stepped out of the shadows, looking disheveled but unharmed. It's okay, she said, raising her hands. He's gone, for now. A wave of relief washed over me. What's going on, Karen? What is this thing? I touched the necklace, still in place around my neck. She sat down beside me, letting out a long sigh. It's a long story, she began. A story that goes back centuries. That necklace, it's not just jewelry. It's a key to an ancient vault hidden somewhere in the city. A vault containing artifacts of unimaginable power. I stared at her, struggling to absorb her words. And Robert, I asked, my mind racing. He's part of an organization that's been searching for the key for generations. They'll stop at nothing to get it. Why me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why did you sell it to me? Karen looked at me with sorrow in her eyes. I thought I could hide it in plain sight. I'm sorry, Sarah. I never meant for you to get dragged into this. We sat there in silence, the gravity of her words sinking in. After a long pause, I stood up. So what do we do now? Karen stood with me, a new resolve in her eyes. Now we find the vault before they do, and we make sure whatever's inside never ends up in the wrong hands. As we walked out of the park, the necklace seemed to throb against my skin, as if it were alive, full of untapped potential. I realized then that my life had changed forever. The ordinary, predictable world I had known was gone, replaced by a dangerous realm of secrets, threats, and untold power. And somehow I was at the heart of it, all because of a necklace I bought on impulse. It's strange how life works sometimes. One seemingly insignificant decision, and suddenly you're thrust into a centuries-old battle with the fate of powerful artifacts resting in your hands. But even with all the fear gripping me, a small part of me felt a rush of exhilaration. For the first time, I felt like I was part of something much bigger than myself. So, with Karen at my side and the weight of the world on my shoulders, I stepped into the night, ready to face whatever came next. After all, I had a vault to find. The moment I saw Nurse Samantha slip those vials into her pocket, I knew my quiet night shift had just taken a terrifying turn. What I didn't expect was that this night would stretch on forever, and I might not make it to morning. My name's Mike, and I've been working as a janitor at St. Andrew's Hospital for almost a year now. The night shift isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills and keeps me out of trouble. Or at least it used to. It was just after 3 a.m., that eerie hour when even the hospital seems to hold its breath. I was making my usual rounds, mop in hand, nodding at the occasional nurse or orderly. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant, mingling with the lingering scent of sickness that never quite leaves a place like this. As I rounded the corner onto the 3rd floor, I spotted her. Nurse Samantha, a large woman with a reputation for being tough as nails, was standing by the supply closet. Nothing strange about that, except for the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, her movements sharp and uneasy. My curiosity got the best of me, and I slowed my pace, pretending to focus on a particularly stubborn stain on the floor. From the corner of my eye, I saw Samantha fumble with the lock on the closet, slip inside, and reappear moments later with her hands full. My heart skipped a beat when I saw her quickly stash several vials into her pocket. I had seen enough TV shows to recognize what was happening, but seeing it for myself, well, that was a whole different thing. I must have made a noise, or maybe she just sensed someone was watching. Samantha's head snapped up, and our eyes locked. For a brief moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of what I just witnessed hanging between us like a live wire. Then she smiled, and the coldness of it froze me in place. "Mike, isn't it?" she said, her voice smooth as honey, but her eyes as sharp as knives. "Just the person I wanted to see. Could you help me with something?" Every instinct I had screamed at me to run. But where would I go? This was my job, my livelihood. Who would believe the night janitor over a respected nurse? So, like an idiot, I nodded and followed her into an empty patient room. The moment the door clicked shut behind us, her entire demeanor shifted. The sweet smile disappeared, replaced by a vicious snarl that made her look more like an animal than a person. "Listen here, you little rat," she hissed, pushing me against the wall. "You didn't see anything. Got it? And if you even think about telling anyone, I'll make sure you regret it. Understand?" I nodded, frantic, my heart pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. "Yes, I understand. I didn't see anything." She studied me for a moment, then stepped back, smoothing her scrubs. "Good. Now get back to work. And Mike, remember, I know where you live." With that chilling reminder, she left, leaving me alone in the room, shaking like a leaf. For the next hour, I went through the motions of my job on autopilot, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't just ignore what I'd seen. People could get hurt if Samantha was stealing medication. But the thought of what she might do if I talked, I was so lost in my thoughts that I almost ran right into Dr. Patel, one of the senior physicians on the night shift. He steadied me with a hand on my shoulder, his brow furrowing with concern. "Are you all right, Mike? You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth, ready to spill everything, but Samantha's threat echoed in my mind. Instead, I mumbled something about not feeling well and hurried past him. As I turned the corner, I caught a glimpse of Samantha watching me from the nurse's station. Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. I quickened my pace, feeling her gaze boring into my back. The rest of the night was a game of cat and mouse. Every time I thought I was alone, Samantha would appear, reminding me of her presence with a pointed look or a too casual brush past me in the hallway. By the time 5 a.m. rolled around, my nerves were shot. I was emptying trash bins in the staff break room when I heard it. Samantha's voice, eyes low and urgent, coming from just outside the door. "I'm telling you, we've got a problem," she was saying. "The janitor saw me. We need to take care of it." My blood turned to ice. Take care of it. What did that mean? A male voice responded, too quiet for me to make out the words. Then Samantha again. "No, we can't wait. It has to be tonight, before he has a chance to talk." I looked around frantically, searching for a way out, but the only exit was the door they were standing in front of. I was trapped. The voices moved away, and I sagged against the wall, my mind reeling. This was no longer about stolen medication. They were talking about silencing me permanently. I had to get out of there, had to tell someone what was going on. But who? The police? Hospital security? Would anyone believe me? Taking a deep breath, I steeled myself and peeked out into the hallway. It was clear now or never. I made my way to the elevator as casually as I could, fighting the urge to break into a run. Just as the doors were about to close, a hand shot out, stopping them. My heart sank as Samantha stepped in, followed by a burly orderly I'd seen around but never spoken to. "Going down, Mike?" Samantha asked, her tone conversational, but her eyes cold. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The elevator began its descent, the tension in the small space so thick I could barely breathe. At the second floor, Samantha turned to me. "Oh, Mike, I just remembered. Could you help us with something in the basement? Won't take but a minute." It wasn't a request. The orderly's hand on my shoulder made that clear. As we exited the elevator into the dimly lit basement, I knew with horrifying certainty that if I went with them, I wouldn't be coming back up. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I shoved the orderly as hard as I could, sending him stumbling into Samantha. Then I ran. I could hear them shouting behind me as I tore through the basement, dodging around storage shelves and equipment. I had no plan, no destination in mind beyond the way. I burst through a fire exit, setting off alarms that pierced the pre-dawn quiet. The cool morning air hit me like a slap to the face as I emerged into the hospital's rear parking lot. Behind me, I could hear the fire door slam open again. "Get him." Samantha's voice rang out. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning, my feet pounding against the asphalt. I had no idea where I was going, only that I couldn't stop. As I reached the street, a car screeched to a halt in front of me, nearly running me over. "Doctor." Patel leaned out of the driver's window, his eyes wide with shock. "Mike, what on earth, please?" I gasped, glancing over my shoulder to see Samantha and the orderly gaining on me. "Help me, they're trying to kill me." Maybe it was the desperation in my voice, or maybe Dr. Patel had already suspected something was off with Samantha. Whatever the reason, he didn't hesitate. "Get in," he said, unlocking the doors. I jumped into the passenger seat just as Samantha reached the car. Dr. Patel slammed the gas pedal, and we sped off, leaving her shouting and cursing behind us. As we drove away from the hospital, words tumbled out of me in a frantic blur. I told him everything, the stolen medication, the threats, the conversation I had overheard. Dr. Patel listened silently, his grip tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles going white. When I finished, he nodded grimly. "I've suspected something was going on for a while now," he said, "but I had no proof until now." He pulled out his phone, still keeping one hand on the wheel. "I'm calling the police and the hospital administrator. This ends now," he added. As I watched him make the calls, a sense of relief washed over me, followed swiftly by exhaustion. The adrenaline that had been keeping me alert was quickly fading, leaving me utterly drained. "What happens now?" I asked as he ended the call. Dr. Patel gave me a reassuring smile. "Now we get you somewhere safe. The police will meet us, and you'll tell them everything you told me. Samantha and her accomplices won't get away with this." As the first light of dawn began to break, casting the sky in pinks and golds, I felt a flicker of hope. The night from hell was over, but a new day had begun. A day where the truth would finally come to light and justice would be served. I leaned back in the seat, closing my eyes for a brief moment. Who would have thought that a simple janitor like me would end up exposing a drug ring? Life sure has a funny way of surprising you. One thing was for sure, I was never going to look at night shifts the same way again. But hey, at least I'd have one hell of a story to tell. Assuming, of course, I lived long enough to tell it. The moment I saw his thumb outstretched, I knew I should have just kept driving. There was something about his posture, the way his eyes glinted in the headlights, that set off a warning in my gut. But it was pouring, the kind of rain that turns everything into a gray blur, and I couldn't bring myself to leave him standing there. I slowed to a stop, my windshield wipers working overtime. As he climbed into the car, I had no idea I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I've always prided myself on being able to read people. It's a skill you pick up when you spend as much time on the road as I do. As a traveling salesperson, I've driven this stretch of highway more times than I can count. I've encountered all sorts. Families stranded with broken down cars, other salespeople hitching rides, the occasional drifter looking for a new start. I thought I'd seen it all. But this guy, he was different. He slid into the passenger seat, bringing with him the scent of rain and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. "Thanks for stopping," he said, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Not many would in this weather." "No problem," I replied, trying to shake the unease settling in my chest as I pulled back onto the empty road. "Where are you headed?" "Just up the road a ways," he said vaguely, his eyes fixed on the rain-slicked asphalt ahead. "I'll let you know when to drop me off." I nodded, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling creeping up on me. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound being the steady drumming of rain on the roof and the swish of the wipers. I stole occasional glances at him. He was younger than me, maybe in his mid-30s, with dark hair that clung to his forehead from the rain. His clothes were nothing special, jeans, a dark jacket, but they looked expensive, out of place for someone hitchhiking in the middle of nowhere. "So," I said, desperate to break the silence, "what brings you out here on a night like this?" He turned to look at me, and a chill ran down my spine. His eyes were unnaturally pale, almost colorless in the dim light. "Car trouble," he said simply. "Broke down a few miles back." "That's rough," I sympathized. "Did you call for a tow?" "No phone," he shrugged. "Besides, I prefer to handle things on my own." The way he said it made my grip on the steering wheel tighten. I tried to change the subject. "I'm Emily, by the way," I offered. He was quiet for a moment, and I wondered if he was going to respond at all. Finally, he said, "John." "Nice to meet you, Emily." We continued driving down the highway, and soon, John started asking me questions. At first, they were simple, where I was from, what I did for a living. But as the conversation went on, I realized he was digging for more personal details. He asked about my family, my relationships, even my daily routine. "You sure seem interested in my life," I said, trying to keep my tone light, despite the growing knot of anxiety in my chest. John smiled, that same smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I find people fascinating," he said. "Everyone has a story, don't they?" I nodded, unsure how to respond. The rain had started to let up, and I found myself wishing it would pour again, if only to fill the increasingly uncomfortable silence. That's when he said something that made my blood run cold. "You know, Emily?" he said casually, as if commenting on the weather. "I've always wondered what it would be like to live in a house like yours, with the big oak tree in the front yard and the wind chimes on the porch." I felt my heart skip a beat. I'd never mentioned anything about my house. How could he possibly know these details? "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. John turned to me, his pale eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Oh, come on, Emily. Don't play coy. I know all about you. Your house at 1542 Maple Street. Your cat, Milo, who likes to sleep on the windowsill. The way you always leave your bedroom window cracked open even on cold nights." My mind reeled. This was impossible. There was no way he could know these things unless "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "How do you know all this?" He laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "I told you, Emily, I find people fascinating, especially people like you. So trusting, so willing to help a stranger." I felt sick. This man, this stranger I had let into my car, had been watching me for how long? Days? Weeks? The thought made me dizzy with fear. "I think you should get out now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I began to slow the car. But John's hand shot out, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "Oh, I don't think so," he said, his voice low and menacing. "We're just getting started, you and I." I yanked my arm free, swerving the car as I did so. "Get out!" I shouted, panic rising in my throat. John's demeanor changed in an instant. Gone was the calm, collected stranger. His face contorted with rage, and he lunged at me, trying to grab the steering wheel. I fought back, struggling to maintain control of the car as we careened down the highway. Rain had started to fall again, making the road slick and treacherous. We wrestled for control, the car swerving wildly across the empty lanes. In the chaos, I managed to slam on the brakes. The car fishtailed, spinning across the wet asphalt. I saw John's eyes widen in surprise just before we hit the guardrail. The impact was deafening. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and I felt a searing pain in my side as I was thrown against the door. Then, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the rain. It was pouring again, drumming on the crumpled roof of the car. I was slumped against the steering wheel, my whole body aching. As I slowly lifted my head, wincing at the pain, I remembered what had happened. John. I turned to the passenger seat, my heart racing. It was empty. The door was open, rain pelting the torn upholstery. There was no sign of him. With shaking hands, I unbuckled my seatbelt and stumbled out of the wreckage. The guardrail was bent and twisted where we'd hit it, but it had kept us from plunging down the steep embankment beyond. I looked around wildly, expecting to see John's body thrown from the car, but there was nothing. He was gone. I limped to the middle of the road, rain soaking through my clothes, and looked in both directions. The highway stretched out, empty and dark in both directions. There was no sign of John, no indication that he had ever been there at all. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the pain in my side intensified. I lifted my shirt to find an angry bruise blooming across my ribs. I needed help. I made my way back to the car, praying my phone had survived the crash. By some miracle it had. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911. The wait for help was agonizing. Every sound made me jump, convinced that John was going to emerge from the darkness to finish what he'd started. But no one came. When the police and ambulance finally arrived, I told them everything. After picking up the hitchhiker, everything seemed to spiral into confusion. The things he knew about me, the eerie tension inside the car, it was all too much to process. The authorities searched the area around the crash site but found nothing. No footprints leading away from where John had disappeared. No blood, just emptiness. At the hospital, as the doctors tended to my injuries, the police pressed me for more details. They were clearly skeptical. How could someone simply vanish from a crash site? And if John had been stalking me, as I claimed, why was there no evidence of him at my home? I began to doubt myself. Had I imagined it all? Was it possible that the stress from my job, the long hours on the road, had caused me to hallucinate the whole thing? But then, just as I was about to leave the hospital, a young officer approached me. He seemed uneasy, glancing around nervously as if worried someone might overhear. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I'm not supposed to tell you this, but you're not the first. We've had similar reports over the years," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Drivers picking up a hitchhiker who knows things he shouldn't, who causes accidents, and then vanishes without a trace." I felt a chill spread through me. "What is he?" I whispered, hardly daring to ask. The officer shook his head. "I don't know. No one does. But be careful out there. And maybe don't pick up any more hitchhikers." I nodded, too stunned to speak. In the weeks that followed, I tried to push the incident out of my mind. I installed a security system in my house, changed my routines, even thought about finding a new job that didn't require so much time on the road. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes, late at night, I think I see a figure standing under the streetlight outside my house. A man with pale, colorless eyes. But when I look again, he's gone. I don't know if John was real, or if he was some kind of supernatural being, or just a product of my imagination. But one thing is certain, I'll never pick up another hitchhiker again. And I always check my rearview mirror, just in case I see that thumb outstretched on the side of the road again. This took place last January. I had decided to take a week off work after New Year's, hoping that by then, everyone else would be back at their jobs, leaving me with some peace and quiet. My plans mostly involved shopping around and just relaxing in my apartment. On this particular day, I had been out driving in the snow, visiting a few stores, and returned home around 7 p.m. Once I got inside, I warmed up and settled on the couch with some snacks I had picked up. I was watching TV, occasionally dozing off after a long day out, when at around 8:30, the apartment's PA system buzzed. That usually meant someone was outside and wanted to be let in. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I had no clue who it could be. The person buzzed again, so I got up and walked over to the window facing the front of the building. I tried to keep the blinds mostly down, only lifting them slightly to get a look. There was a tall man standing at the building's entrance. It was still snowing lightly, and the sky was darkening, but I could tell he was older, probably in his mid-40s. He was unfamiliar to me. At the time, there were only 3 other people living in the complex, and I knew them all. He didn't belong here. I thought that if he did, someone would have let him in by now. I muted the PA system, went back to the couch, and resumed watching TV. I didn't give it much thought, even dozing off a couple more times over the next hour. Eventually, I decided to turn off the TV and head to bed, probably around 10. As soon as I lay down, I fell asleep. A few hours later, I was jolted awake by a loud thud coming from just outside my room. It was incredibly loud, and at first, I had no idea what it was or where it had come from. My heart pounded as I stared at the door, listening intently for any other sounds. Everything had gone quiet again, almost too quiet. I got out of bed cautiously and crept toward the door, pressing my ear against it to listen. It was still silent, just the creaking of the building. I turned the handle and slowly opened the door, scanning the living room. Nothing seemed out of place. The apartment was dark, and for some reason, I felt like I had to remain as quiet as possible, so I kept the lights off. I moved cautiously through the living room, glancing down the hallway. The door to my apartment was wide open. I froze, staring at it in shock, my body filled with fear. Felt surreal. I stepped back, trying to stay as silent as possible, and slowly made my way back to my room. That's when I saw the huge dent in the door, right by the knob. It was then I panicked, ran into my room, locked the door behind me, and called 911 while hiding in the closet. I was certain the person was still inside, and I feared it was only a matter of time before they would come after me. But the apartment remained eerily quiet. The intruder was gone by the time the police arrived. They couldn't find any clues as to who it was. Their theory is that the man had tried buzzing other rooms until someone let him in. Once he was in the stairwell, it's unclear why he chose to target my apartment. Maybe he thought it was empty. What's most bizarre is the dent in my bedroom door, which was likely the source of the thud that woke me up. But it looked more like a single, frustrated hit, not a real attempt to break the door down. He must have left soon after. Since then, nothing else has happened in the apartment. Who the man was and what he wanted remains a mystery. When I first bought the house, it seemed perfect. A century-old Victorian with a wraparound porch, tall bay windows, and enough space to finally have a home office. The previous owner had passed away, and the property had sat vacant for years, making it a steal on the market. I was willing to overlook the creaky floorboards, the outdated wiring, even the faint smell of dust and decay that clung to the walls. But then I found the door. I had been living there for a week when I noticed it. Tucked away in the farthest corner of the second floor, half hidden behind an old bookcase, was a door I had never seen before. It was different from the others in the house. Plain, unpainted wood, no handle, no lock, just a featureless slab, blending so seamlessly into the wall that I almost missed it entirely. Curiosity got the better of me. I pushed on it, expecting resistance, but it swung open with ease, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The basement. I had been in the basement before, but this wasn't the same entrance. The usual door was in the kitchen, leading to a storage area filled with old furniture and rusting tools. But this staircase led somewhere else. My phone flashlight barely cut through the gloom as I descended. The air grew thick, heavy, like stepping into another time. At the bottom, I found a room, unfinished, its brick walls covered in strange, erratic scratches. The floor was bare concrete, the only piece of furniture an old wooden chair in the center of the room, facing the doorway. And then I saw the drawings. Faint at first, then more distinct as I moved my light across the walls. Hundreds of them, carved deep into the brick. Figures, faces, all twisted in expressions of horror. Some had eyes scratched out. Others had mouths stretched wide, as if screaming in silence. I shivered, stepping closer to one, running my fingers along the grooves. That's when I heard it. A creak. Not from above, not from the house shifting. From inside the room. I spun around, my flashlight bouncing off the walls. The chair was empty, but it hadn't been before. I ran, scrambled up the stairs, slammed the door shut behind me, shoved the bookcase back in place. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding against my ribs. That night, I locked my bedroom door. I barely slept, every sound magnified in the silence of the house. The next morning, I told myself it had been my imagination. I had been tired, overwhelmed by the stress of moving. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with that room. A week passed before I checked again. The door was still there. The bookcase hadn't moved, but somehow, the air around it felt different, heavier, as if something had been waiting. I pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. I exhaled, relieved. Maybe it really had just been my imagination. Then, from the other side of the door, came a whisper. Let me out. I haven't gone down there since. At first, I convinced myself it had been a trick of my mind, a product of exhaustion and stress. But as the days passed, the whispers became harder to ignore. At night, I would lie in bed and hear faint rustling sounds coming from the walls. Soft, scraping noises as though someone or something was dragging their fingers across the wood. I started keeping my bedroom door locked, but even that didn't bring comfort. Some nights, I swore I heard footsteps outside my room, slow and deliberate, stopping just beyond the threshold. Then came the dreams. In them, I was back in the basement, standing before the old wooden chair. But this time, the room wasn't empty. A figure sat slumped in the chair, its back to me. Its arms, impossibly long, rested limp at its sides. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the cold concrete. The figure shifted slightly, its head tilting as though listening. Then, without warning, it stood. I woke up drenched in sweat, the air in my bedroom stifling. I reached for my phone, desperate for distraction. But when I unlocked the screen, my breath caught in my throat. A new note had been typed in my phone's notepad. You found me. My hands trembled. I hadn't written that. I barely had the courage to breathe, let alone move. But as I forced myself to scan the room, the worst realization came crashing down on me. The bookcase had been moved. The door was open, a yawning black void leading back down to that basement. The air around me felt thick, charged with something unseen. And then, just as I gathered my courage to reach for the bookcase, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak coming from the stairs. Something was coming up. Last summer, my boyfriend and I went camping in a nature preserve in Pennsylvania. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it was pretty rustic camping. There was no cell service, and we saw only 2 other people the entire time we were there. The place was massive, so it felt pretty empty. Right away, my boyfriend said there was something off about these 2 people we had seen. I'm not sure if they had anything to do with what happened later, but I'll describe them. The first person was a woman with a truck parked off the trail, the hood up. I'm not really one to pay attention to details like that, but my boyfriend thought she was waiting for someone to pull up and offer help with her truck. Normally, he's the type to at least offer to call for help, but he said something about her gave him the creeps. He didn't even want to draw attention to her. The other person we saw drove by a few times while we were setting up camp. He kept circling by slowly, staring at us. I didn't notice at first, but my boyfriend pointed out that he had driven by twice already. Whether these two people were involved in what happened or not, the real story begins around 3 a.m. when something woke us up. The noise was incredibly loud and sudden. I can't even describe it, and nothing I've ever heard compares to it. My boyfriend said it sounded like a chain gun revving up or someone scraping gravel with a large tool. He jumped up and looked out of the small tent window. The noise happened again, over and over, and it was getting closer each time. I was terrified, but my boyfriend told me it was probably miles away. I didn't question him because loud noises can carry a long distance, right? Well, later my boyfriend told me he had said that to calm me down, because it really sounded like it was coming from right down the dirt road. By 1 a.m., he thought it was right in front of our campsite. The only reason he didn't tell me to get out and run to the car was because he didn't want to panic me. He was afraid it was someone trying to scare us out of the tent for some unknown reason. Looking back, I should have realized something was wrong when he was whispering, but I didn't. Normally, he would have just spoken normally, right? I couldn't fall asleep, though, because every little sound I heard outside made me think someone was sneaking up on the tent. Eventually, my boyfriend told me to get up and help him pack up. It was about 20 minutes after the sound stopped when he grabbed our only weapon, a machete, and held it in front of him. It was a full moon, so we didn't need a flashlight. While we were packing quickly, I noticed an empty beer can near our dead campfire. It definitely wasn't there when we went to sleep at around 10 p.m., and neither of us had bought any beer. Thankfully, we managed to leave, and the rest of the trip was great. After that, we camped in areas where there were more people around or we booked a hotel. Sometimes, it's just not worth the risk when you're in the middle of nowhere. One moment, she was right there, her yellow jacket standing out against the backdrop of green and brown. The next, she was gone, vanished as if the earth itself had claimed her. I've replayed that moment over and over in my mind, hoping to find something I overlooked, some sign that could explain how my 5-year-old daughter disappeared in broad daylight. But all I'm left with is the painful truth that I looked away for just a second. And in that second, everything changed. It was supposed to be a regular day at the park. Lily and I had been coming here ever since she was a baby. It was our place, a large, green escape in the middle of the city, with meandering trails, a pond full of ducks, and a playground that Lily loved. We knew this park like the back of our hands, or so I thought. The day had started like any other. Lily was full of excitement, babbling about feeding the ducks and playing on the swings. I grabbed a bag with some snacks, her favorite stuffed rabbit, and a loaf of bread for the ducks. As we made our way to the park, Lily skipped ahead. Her yellow jacket, a gift from her grandmother, made it easy to keep an eye on her, even when she wandered a bit too far. We arrived at the park shortly after lunch. The weather was beautiful, unseasonably warm for early autumn, and the park was filled with people. Families enjoying picnics, joggers making their way along the paths, and older visitors feeding the ducks. Lily couldn't wait to get to the playground, so we headed there next, her little hand tightly gripping mine. At the playground, Lily dashed from one piece of equipment to another, her energy seemingly endless. I sat on a nearby bench, keeping a watchful eye on her while she played. Other parents were doing the same, creating a relaxed atmosphere of enjoyment. After about an hour, Lily came running up to me, cheeks flushed from the activity. "Mommy, can we feed the ducks now?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Of course, sweetheart," I replied, standing up and gathering our things. "Let's go." We walked hand in hand toward the pond, Lily skipping along every few steps. When we reached the water's edge, a group of ducks immediately swam over, clearly accustomed to being fed by visitors. Lily's giggles filled the air as they quacked and jostled for food. I pulled out the bread and handed Lily a piece. "Remember," I said, "small pieces so they don't choke." Lily nodded seriously, tearing the bread into tiny pieces and tossing them to the eager ducks. Her laughter echoed across the water as the ducks rushed for the crumbs, sending ripples across the surface. We stood there for a while, Lily mesmerized by the ducks, and I simply enjoyed watching her happiness. It was a perfect moment. One of those times when you wish you could freeze frame your life and stay there forever. But life doesn't work that way. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, seeing a text from my boss about an urgent work matter. I sighed, knowing I needed to respond but not wanting to take my attention away from Lily. "Sweetheart," I said, "Mommy needs to answer this message real quick. Stay right here where I can see you." "Okay." Lily nodded, her attention still focused on the ducks. I stepped back a few paces, my eyes still on her as I began to type out a response. It was a complex issue, requiring more of my attention than I'd anticipated. I found myself rereading the message, formulating a careful reply. Couldn't have been more than a minute, maybe two at most. But when I looked up from my phone, Lily was gone. At first, I wasn't worried. Lily had a habit of wandering a few steps away, distracted by a butterfly or an interesting leaf. I scanned the immediate area, expecting to see her yellow jacket bobbing along the water's edge. Nothing. "Lily," I called out, my voice calm, but with an edge of concern. No response. I walked along the shore, my eyes darting back and forth, searching for that familiar splash of yellow. My heart began to beat faster as I realized she wasn't anywhere near the pond. "Lily," I called again, louder this time. A few nearby people looked up, registering the panic in my voice. I spun around, my eyes frantically searching every direction. The playground was empty. The picnic area was full of strangers. No sign of Lily anywhere. The panic that had been building in my chest exploded. "Lily!" I screamed, my voice echoing across the park. People stopped what they were doing, turning to look at the crazy woman yelling at the top of her lungs. I ran back to the playground, hoping against hope that she had returned there. Empty swings creaked in the breeze, mocking me with their emptiness. I checked under the slide, behind the bushes, anywhere a small child might hide. Nothing. By now, other people in the park had realized something was wrong. A young couple approached me, concern etched on their faces. "Are you okay?" the woman asked. "What's wrong?" "My daughter," I gasped, struggling to breathe through the panic. "She's missing. She was just here, and now she's gone. She's 5 years old, wearing a yellow jacket. Please, have you seen her?" They shook their heads, but immediately offered to help search. Within minutes, a small army of strangers had mobilized, spreading out across the park, calling Lily's name. I don't know who called the police, but suddenly they were there asking me questions I could barely focus on. What was she wearing? When did I last see her? Did she know anyone in the park? I answered as best I could, my mind replaying those last moments over and over. Her laughter as she fed the ducks, the way the sunlight glinted off her hair, the yellow of her jacket bright against the green of the grass. Hours passed in a blur. The police searched every inch of the park. Divers were called in to check the pond, a possibility I couldn't bear to consider. As night fell, they brought in dogs to try and pick up her scent. Nothing. It was as if Lily had simply ceased to exist. One moment there, the next gone, leaving no trace behind. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The police investigation continued, but leads were scarce. Lily's face was plastered on posters all over the city, broadcast on every news channel. I appeared on TV, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The theories were endless. She was abducted. She wandered off and got lost. She fell into the pond and the divers somehow missed her. Each possibility was more horrifying than the last. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My life became entirely consumed by the search for Lily. I quit my job, dedicating every moment to retracing our steps from that day, speaking with anyone who might have seen something. But as the days stretched on, hope began to slip away. The police visits grew less frequent. The news stories shifted focus to other cases. People stopped recognizing me in the street, stopped offering their sympathy or theories. It felt as though life was moving forward, while I was left behind, frozen in that instant by the pond, forever turning away from my daughter for the last time. A year after Lily disappeared, I returned to the park. I'm not sure what I hoped to find. Maybe some overlooked clue, some piece of evidence that had slipped through the cracks, or perhaps I just needed to be where I had last seen her to feel closer to her. I stood by the pond, watching the ducks drift lazily through the water. A little girl in a red coat ran past, her mother calling after her to be careful. A sharp ache hit my chest, so intense it almost took my breath away. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There, partially hidden in the reeds at the water's edge, was a flash of yellow. My heart skipped a beat. With trembling hands, I reached out and pulled it free. It was a piece of fabric worn and faded, but undeniably the same bright yellow as Lily's jacket. How had this gone unnoticed? How had I missed it in all my searches? I held the fabric to my chest, tears streaming down my face. It wasn't the answer I had been hoping for. It wasn't Lily, but it was something. A concrete reminder that she had been there, that I hadn't imagined everything. Standing there with that small piece of yellow fabric, I made a vow to Lily, to myself, and to whatever higher force might be listening. I would never stop searching, never stop hoping. Somewhere out there, my daughter was waiting to be found, and I would search until my very last breath to bring her back. The park continued around me. Children laughed, ducks quacked, joggers passed by. But for me, time stood still. In my mind, Lily was still 5 years old, still wearing her yellow jacket, still just beyond my reach. And I would keep reaching, keep searching, until I found her once more. Not every town is fortunate enough to have a peaceful bay just beyond its downtown. Most aren't blessed with neighbors who all know each other, working together as if they're in a community game, bringing everyone together even into the late hours. The idea of a simpler, happier life echoes through every church bell and backyard radio in this place. It's a town where the grass is always neatly cut in perfect rows, and the little beach shops always have sand resting on their doormats. The spray from the ocean constantly dances over everything it can touch, enveloping the town in a salty haze, leaving behind nothing but faded footprints and ripple marks. I was once told that any moment in this town could be caught in a photograph and displayed for the world to see the happiness that exists there. Nothing captures that better than the prints left on the beach every morning. A father and daughter, knowing they can beat the sunrise to the water if they leave early enough, race to the docks as they always do. They haven't even had breakfast, but excitement fills them up more than food ever could. And so their journey begins. After a quick sprint down the wide residential street and along the sturdy dock, the daughter wins her race against the light. As the sun peeks through the waves, the two walk together, their footprints speaking volumes of the bond they share. The father's larger shoes always take the side closer to the water, and the daughter's smaller footprints wander aimlessly, as if distracted by anything in her path. These footprints are their story, told over and over again. But one day, that story changed. It was one of the rare mornings when I didn't work the graveyard shift at the fire station the night before, a rare moment where I let the sun win. But those two didn't let that happen. They went out on that windy morning just as they always did. However, just after they stepped away from the dock and left their first marks in the sand, the footprints veered off into the ocean without any break in their pattern. The act was as bold as the waves crashing against the shore, a move made without hesitation, as if they had no concept of anything different. After the waves pulled back, only one set of footprints returned. The father, the man who had once seen stars ahead of him when he lost the race to the beach, had discarded his daughter to the sea as if she were just a burden, like a backpack too heavy to carry. It almost seemed like the waves themselves were trying to give her back, but not even the sea's power could return a life taken too soon. Now, sitting on a bench overlooking the docks, I bring a steaming cup of coffee to my dry lips, hoping for the energy to open my eyes fully. The warmth of the mug pushes back the biting wind. This town has never had such consistent windy mornings, and the wind has never been this loud. It drowns out everything but the view of the beach. The beach covered in footprints and the man walking across it. I freeze in place, summoning every ounce of strength to track the figure with my gaze. He is darker than the sand beneath him, and the weak moonlight offers little help in defining him. Just a tall, shadowy outline. There's something incomplete about him, as if I could walk closer and see right through him. His steps seem off too. They're slow, dragging through the sand as if it were soaked with the ocean's tide. He moves like a figure from an old, worn photograph, crushed beneath the weight of countless albums and papers. As I continue to watch, I begin to feel that same weight, like it's pressing down on me. The pressure of the world seems to be pushing me down, as if the stone terrace beneath me will give way, but it's not the world. It's my own body shutting down. Drowsiness begins to overtake me, and I spill my last sips of coffee across my face in an attempt to stay awake, to keep myself from falling. But it doesn't work. In that moment of pain and alertness and fear, I finally feel the figure's attention land on me. And seconds later, I feel the cold stone catch my fall. 1 month later, it took a while for me to visit the beach again. Town lit up with a series of reports of missing children, almost 2 per week. Nothing is ever supposed to happen in this town. After one death pushed its way in, more found the fracture in our sense of safety and immediately rushed in. Everybody thought it was somehow all connected, but nothing ever actually proved that until one of the bodies washed back up on the beach. The only thing that could have done that was a storm or an unheard of wonder of nature. And we don't get storms around here. I'm glad I was sitting at the beach that day. Work took up most of the last few weeks, and pure dread kept me from using my little free time to take the walk to my usual morning spot. As I finally walk up in this still moment, the first thing I notice is the breeze. It's nothing like the howling wind that still rages through my memory. Finding new confidence, I finish the walk and end up all the way on the beach proper. There, I notice the footprints, or I suppose I should say footprint. The sand is only covered by a single line of marks, as if only one shoe had been planted in the sand by a person who was hopping along the beach earlier in the morning. But people who hop don't drag their feet, and there's something about these footprints that don't sit well with me. They leave tortuous, drawn-out marks in the disturbed sand, and they shift and shake with the unsteadiness of a dust storm. I follow the prints with my eyes, right up to the figure standing only a few dozen yards away from me. What faces me is half of the shape of a man, and the other half dissolving into a mist of sand and floating gently into the ocean. The solid half, the part of him that isn't standing over moving water, looks coarse and damaged by time. He is standing more still than any human ever could, stiller than the pictures of this very beach that I have hanging in my house. I know right away what I'm staring at. There is only one man that I've ever seen make his mark on this beach at this early hour. The man that took his daughter there to find happiness. The same man that took his daughter there to meet her final moments. We never truly know what other people hide from the world, afraid that the parts of themselves that they find in dreams will make themselves real. We sleep at dead of night to keep that sinister spirit at bay, giving it only the briefest glimpses of a fabricated life that is freed from any morality. Nothing is more terrifying than that version of ourselves, the one that exists only to disagree with the world. Inside of that father was a darker half, a second piece of his being that was forced to become part of the earth as his better half searched for his daughter in the sea. Now, that is the only part of him that is left to make footprints in the sand that has so relentlessly taken him. I watch as he walks his path, the pure evil making its way along the beach, as his older, kinder soul fades away from that horrible frame, desperate to escape to a place where his daughter can finally rest. As if he knows I am making the horrific realization of what I'm looking at, the dark figure turns to face me, his thin frame twisting and warping like a broken branch caught in a hurricane. He then begins to take those dreadful steps towards me. With every footprint he leaves, another maddening thought crashes its way into my mind. I think about the sensation of my fear doubling down on me. I think about the plight of this man's poor daughter. I think about all the people that never had any idea that the mourning man in front of me had kept this true monster hidden from the entire world without a single trace to be seen. I think about the heart-sinking feeling of powerlessness that I imagine the daughter felt in the moment she felt herself submit to her horrible father. Drowsiness invades my mind as if I can't even stay lucid long enough to come to terms with a world that allows such evil to overcome all those things that are good and pure. It isn't a world I want to exist in. That father shouldn't be able to outlive his daughter, and I don't want to watch him leave those lonely footprints in the sand every morning, the manifesto of his deceptions. I let the soft feeling of dread wash over me, and it doesn't take long for the waves to wash over me too. To my brother, I'm sure I'm just another victim of his fading soul. This happened to me last semester. I'm a college student, and up until this point, I had only positive experiences, except for this one encounter. I'm a psychology major, and after taking AP classes in high school and a few extra classes over the summer, I was ahead of my peers. Last semester, I signed up for a neuroscience course which was a bit more advanced, and all the students in the class were juniors or seniors, most of them about to graduate. I was just a freshman. On the first day, I arrived at the classroom, but the professor was late. There was a crowd of students outside, so I asked one of the guys if he was waiting for the same class. He said yes. He introduced himself as Braxton, and that was it. The professor arrived, and the class went well. At the end, Braxton asked for my number, claiming it would be useful if we needed to discuss homework assignments. I thought he'd be a good person to know. I was wrong. I saw him twice a week for an hour and a half, and within just 2 weeks, despite only seeing him in class, he told me he felt a connection to me and that I was the most beautiful and fascinating girl he had ever met. I brushed off the connection part and thanked him for the compliment. That should have been the end of it. The following week, he texted me out of nowhere, asking if I had anxiety. I hesitantly admitted that I did, but kept it vague, mentioning that large crowds were my biggest trigger but that I managed fine. He insisted that if I ever needed to escape, he knew a few spots that were quiet and deserted. I told him I was okay, and he seemed to drop the topic. The next week, we said our goodbyes as usual, and I started heading to my next class. Typically, we wouldn't see each other until class 2 days later. But this time, he turned around quickly and started walking next to me. I told him I was fine and that he could go to his own class. He refused. He said, "No, it's fine. I want to walk you to math. I know people scare you." I stopped dead in my tracks and asked him how he knew I had math class after our neuroscience class. He told me not to worry about it. As much as I was weirded out, I ignored it. Keep in mind, I had never once told him my schedule or really any specifics about myself. He dropped me off and I felt relief thinking that was that. I brushed it off as him just trying to be a gentleman. An hour and a half later, he was waiting for me right outside the room and then said, "Let's get you to English." I lied and told him that my English class had been canceled and alarms had gone off in my head because this kid apparently knew my schedule and where my classes were located and at what times. Although I again ignored it because I didn't want to be rude to him, and I took it as him just trying to be nice, so I forgot about it. After that incident, everything seemed normal until it wasn't. As I stated earlier, I have pretty bad anxiety, and to this day in particular, I was having a pretty off day. Class started and I grew more and more anxious and had to step out, so I did. I went to the bathroom and calmed myself down and returned quietly only to notice that Braxton was not in his seat and came back soon after and took a seat right behind me and immediately whispered in my ear, "Don't you ever leave without my permission again? Do you understand me?" I just nodded and apologized so we would stop, and then he returned back to normal. One of his few obsessions with me was that something would happen to me and that he had to protect me at all costs. If I wasn't okay, he would flip out and do anything in his power to return me to an okay state. It was odd. There were a few instances in which it got really freaky. One of these instances was the day he noticed my medical bracelet for hypoglycemia. As soon as he noticed it, he started interrogating me about why I had it, what it was, if I take medications, when was my last episode, etc. He then proceeded to grab my hand to try and snap a picture of my parents' phone numbers on the back. I told him it wasn't his business, and if he really needed that information one day, he would have it on my wrist. He got upset but dropped it. That Friday, he had called me from his job. He worked at a hospital doing office-type work, I guess, and said, "Hey, I have you on speaker and I'm with one of my colleagues. I need you to explain your condition, why it happens, and give me a list of medications you take. What's your severest episode?" I told him it was completely out of line and hung up on him, and he blew up my phone telling me how important it was to get help and how important it was for him to know everything about it. I ignored him. Next time I saw him, he acted normal and even apologized for his actions. We moved on until the next thing happened. I twisted my ankle pretty badly on campus, and I had been crying, and it was pretty obvious I was in pain and stressed. As soon as he had seen me, he completely flipped out, asking who did this to me, if I was okay, if I needed medications, and then demanded he was going to take me to my university's clinic. He told me I wasn't allowed to call my mother and that only he would deal with this. I told him that he didn't control me, and I ended up calling my mom, obviously, or she told me to go to the clinic and she would pick me up there. I told Braxton that we could just get an escort by campus police. The clinic was a few blocks away, and he immediately shut that down and got extremely upset. "No, we're absolutely not going with the police. I'm going to get an Uber, but we're not going with the police. Do not even think about telling the police." This was extremely alarming to me because why did he want to stay away from the police so badly? He ended up calling an Uber and we got to the clinic. He insisted being right by my side the entire time and wanted me to hold his hand. He kept trying to rub my back and touch me. I told him to stop and that I didn't want him touching me and for him to just leave. He insisted on staying, and there really was not much I could do, so I dealt with it until my mother came to get me. I was extremely tense and kept my hands to myself and just sat still. After I left, he followed up with multiple texts, asking if I was okay and if I could keep him updated. I ignored all of his messages. Towards the end of the semester, a mutual friend we had in that class messaged me asking if Braxton had ever made me feel uncomfortable. I told her the truth and the multiple instances that I immediately got bad vibes from him and that I progressively felt worse being near him. Not even 5 minutes later, I sent the message to her. Braxton starts blowing up my phone, calling, texting, leaving voicemails. He kept threatening me, saying that he was going to find me, and as soon as he finds me, that it was over for me. He said that I had ruined his life and that he hated me and that I was a horrible person, and he said when he sees me next, he was going to show me what I deserved and that I had no idea what was coming for me. His voicemails were so full of rage. His voice was so shaky because of how angry he was, and he was yelling his heart out in one voicemail and in the next, sobbing about why I didn't love him back and how I could betray him like this. I obviously didn't go to school that day, and his hundreds of voicemails and texts alternated between rage and apologies and every emotion in between. It was terrifying. The only reason I didn't block this guy or tell anyone about him was because I was terrified he would do something to me. He would remind me that if I was scared of him now, he would give me a reason to be scared later. Either if I went to the police or tried distancing myself more. He found every single one of my study spots. I am a commuter, so I would study and stay at many different coffee shops. And if I wasn't at the ones I usually stayed at, he would message me saying that he would find me if I didn't tell him where I was. He told me if I ever went to the police that he would give me a reason to go to the police, things like that. He also shared with me that he would fantasize about me, how badly he wanted me. He said he loved the way I smelled and even wanted pieces of my hair to keep at home. It was awful. At the very end of the semester, I completely stopped talking to him and he seemed to have gotten the hint. I moved seats in class and he didn't seem to bother me after I had made it evident that I wanted nothing to do with him. During the final week of the semester, things took a disturbing turn. He began taking pictures of me from across campus and sending them to me from different numbers. His messages would include things like, "You're just gorgeous today. I love you so much. I wish you loved me back." And then, chillingly, "You'll pay for this, your betrayal to me and humankind." On the last day of classes, I got on my commuter bus, and as I settled in on my way home, I received a text from him. It was a video of me boarding the bus, and his message said, "See you soon, darling." I was absolutely paranoid for weeks after that. Thankfully, nothing else happened. He never contacted me again, and I didn't see him at all after that semester. He deleted all his social media accounts, and I can only hope that he either moved away or graduated. Honestly, I just hope he's far, far away. The first scratch on the wall was so faint that I almost didn't notice it. But as I ran my fingers over the rough surface, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Something was in the walls of this old cabin. Something alive, something moving. And as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the room, I realized with mounting dread that I was trapped here with whatever it was. My name's Daniel, and I've always preferred solitude. So when I inherited my great-uncle's cabin in the woods, it seemed like the perfect chance to escape for a while. I had been feeling burned out from my hectic life in the city, and the thought of spending a few weeks surrounded by nothing but nature was incredibly inviting. The cabin was just as I remembered from childhood visits. Small, rustic, tucked into a clearing, miles away from the nearest neighbor. As I pulled up in my rental car, a wave of nostalgia washed over me. I could almost smell my great-uncle Frank's pipe tobacco and hear his deep, hearty laugh. The first few days were peaceful. I hiked during the day, enjoying the sights of the dense forest and the crystal-clear streams. In the evenings, I sat on the porch with a book, listening to the chorus of crickets and watching the fireflies flutter in the dimming light. But on the fourth night, I first heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from inside the walls. At first, I shrugged it off, thinking it was just mice. The cabin was old, after all, and it wasn't surprising that some critters had made their home here. But as I lay in bed that night, the scratching grew louder, more persistent. It seemed to move, traveling from one wall to another. This wasn't a mouse. The next morning, I examined the walls carefully. That's when I found the first scratch marks. Long, deep gouges in the wooden panels. They were too large to have been made by any rodent I knew of. I tried to convince myself that maybe a raccoon had somehow gotten into the walls. But deep down, I knew that explanation didn't quite add up. The scratches were too deliberate, too intentional. As the day dragged on, I found myself jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. The scratching had stopped, but the silence felt suffocating, like a storm was brewing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, every nerve on edge, waiting for the sound to start again. And when it did, it was different. Now, it wasn't just scratching. It was a soft thudding, like something heavy was moving through the walls. I quickly got up and grabbed a flashlight from the bedside table. My hands trembled as I shined the beam along the walls. The scratching seemed to be coming from behind the old fireplace. As I moved closer, the noise stopped abruptly. I stood there, heart pounding, straining my ears in the silence. Then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. A low guttural growl coming from inside the wall. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. This was no animal. At least, no animal I'd ever encountered. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, jumping at every sound. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I was in my car, driving towards town. The local diner was just opening when I arrived. I must have looked a sight, pale, disheveled, with dark circles under my eyes. The waitress, a kindly older woman named Betty, took one look at me and brought over a strong cup of coffee. "You all right, honey?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I laughed nervously. "Not a ghost," I said, "but something. I'm staying at my uncle's old cabin, and there's something in the walls." Betty's expression changed. A flicker of, was that fear? Frank's old place? She asked. "Up on Willow Creek Road." I nodded, surprised. "You knew my uncle?" She sighed, glancing around the empty diner before sliding into the booth across from me. "Everyone around here knew Frank," she said, "and everyone knows about that cabin." My heart sank. "What do you mean?" Betty leaned in, lowering her voice. "There's always been stories about that place. Even before your uncle bought it, people say it's not right, that there's something living in the walls, something that's been there for a long, long time." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What kind of something?" She shook her head. "Nobody knows for sure. Some say it's a spirit, angry at being disturbed. Others think it's some kind of creature, hibernating for years at a time. Your uncle, he never believed the stories, said it was just superstition." I thought about the scratches, the growl I'd heard. "It's real," I said. "Whatever it is, it's real." Betty reached out, patting my hand. Listen, honey, if I were you, I'd pack up and leave. Some things it's better not to mess with. But I couldn't just leave. The cabin was mine now, my responsibility. And a part of me, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries and the unknown, wanted to know what was hiding in those walls. I spent the day in town researching the cabin's history and buying supplies, including a sturdy axe. As the sun began to set, I steeled myself and drove back up to the cabin. The scratching started as soon as night fell. But this time I was prepared, or so I thought. I approached the wall where the sound was loudest, axe in hand. With a deep breath, I swung, the blade biting into the old wood. The scratching stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, a roar that shook the very foundations of the cabin. The wall in front of me bulged outward, with splintering. I stumbled back, raising the axe defensively. But I wasn't prepared for what emerged. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Vaguely humanoid, but covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes glowed in the dim light, fixed on me with an intelligence that was terrifyingly unnatural. For a moment, we stared at each other, frozen in mutual shock. Then it lunged. I swung the axe wildly, feeling it connect with something solid. The creature howled, a sound of pain and rage that sent me scrambling towards the door, but it was faster. A clawed hand grabbed my ankle, pulling me down. I kicked out, my foot connecting with its face. It let go, and I scrambled to my feet, running for the car. I could hear it behind me, its heavy breathing and the thud of its footsteps spurring me on. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys. Just as I got the door open, it slammed into me from behind. We went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling across the forest floor. Its face was inches from mine, hot breath reeking of decay. I could see my terrified reflection in its glowing eyes. In desperation, I grabbed a rock from the ground and smashed it against the creature's head. It reared back, momentarily stunned. I took my chance, scrambling into the car and locking the doors. The engine roared to life and I floored it, tires spinning on the dirt road. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creature standing in the middle of the road, its eyes locked on me as I drove away. Its howl of frustration echoed through the air, following me all the way down the mountain. I didn't stop until I hit the city limits. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely grip the steering wheel. I never returned to the cabin. I sold it at a loss to a developer who planned to tear it down. I didn't tell him about what lived in the walls. Maybe I should have, but who would have believed me? Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up in a cold sweat, that eerie howl still echoing in my mind. I'll never forget those glowing eyes, that ancient, alien intelligence. And I can't help but wonder if there was only one of those creatures. Could there be more? How long had they been hiding in the walls of old houses, in the dark corners we never think to check? One thing's for sure, I'll never look at an old cabin in the woods the same way again. Because now I know that sometimes the walls really do have eyes, claws, and an appetite for unsuspecting visitors. I had just gotten home from work and was relaxing on the couch with a movie on. It was storming outside, and since it was Friday, I figured there was no better way to spend the night than staying up late and watching TV. I kept the window curtains open, hoping to catch some lightning flashes. It doesn't rain often where I live, so nights like this were rare and always excited me. As the night went on, around midnight, I noticed something outside my window. Across the street, there was a man walking down the sidewalk. He didn't have a coat or hood on and was completely drenched, but he walked up to a house and stood on the porch. I couldn't see much through the rain and darkness, but it looked like he was waiting for someone to answer the door. After a minute, he walked back down the sidewalk and continued down the street. I couldn't see any further, but seeing that man gave me an uneasy feeling. It just didn't feel normal for someone to be out walking to houses in the middle of a storm at this time of night. I closed the curtains to avoid being seen in case he came to my door. I didn't want to give him the idea that I'd be answering. Only about 15 minutes later, I heard a sound outside. Someone was walking up my driveway, heading to the front door, but there was no knock or ring of the doorbell. I could hear them moving around, walking across the porch and near one of the windows before returning to the door. I was really confused and wanted to check through the peephole, but I didn't want them to hear me. After a minute, the sounds stopped. I quietly walked over to the door and peered out. It was the same man from earlier, still standing at the edge of my porch, staring blankly at the door. I watched him for a few seconds, getting more creeped out by the moment, then stepped back. That's when I really started to consider calling the police. It didn't seem right that he was going from house to house, acting so strangely. I turned to grab my phone, but then I heard footsteps walking away. I looked outside again, and he was gone. After some thought, I felt it was too strange and unsettling not to report. I called the police and explained what had happened. They said they'd send an officer to patrol the neighborhood and see if they could find the man or at least get him to explain himself. That was about all they could do for now, and after thanking them, I hung up. I checked the door one last time before heading back to the couch. The whole thing had really worn me out though, taking away the relaxing night and just making me exhausted. I shut everything off and went upstairs to get in bed. But as I got in and turned off the lights, a thump sounded from downstairs. I sat up and then it came again. It was loud, like someone smashing something against the wall. I got up and ran to the top of the stairs. And now hearing it for the third time, I realized it was at the front door. Someone was hitting something against it like they were trying to forcefully break it down. I walked down a few steps and looked over, seeing the door violently shake every time they hit it. It looked like they were just a few hits away from breaking it down. Now absolutely terrified, I locked myself in the bedroom and called the police again. The operator said that an officer was in the neighborhood and would be here in just a minute. But through their voice, I heard would shatter and the door slamming against the ground. Footsteps quickly moved through the downstairs, going into every room without stopping. Then they began moving up the stairs, but were cut off by the officer pulling in and running up to the house. The intruder immediately stopped and ran for the back door as the officer came in and yelled at him. And apparently they had trouble getting the back door open in the heat of the moment, so the officer was able to get him down and into the car. The man, who looked like a psycho up close, refused to say anything, like not even a single word before they drove him off. His intentions were clear though. He was carrying a heavy hammer and had a bunch of zip ties in his pocket. That doesn't exactly sound like a coincidence considering what he was doing. Why he chose to go for my house isn't clear though. But what likely saved me was calling the police that first time. If I hadn't, the officer wouldn't have been in the neighborhood so close by and likely would have gotten here too late for me to have ever been seen again. The line between an adventure and a nightmare is much thinner than most people realize. One wrong move, one misinterpreted word, and suddenly you're fighting for your life against people who see you as an intruder in their world. I learned this lesson the hard way in the Appalachian Mountains, where my search for solitude quickly turned into a fight for survival. I'd always been intrigued by the idea of solo camping. There's something captivating about being alone in nature, depending only on your own abilities and instincts. So when I unexpectedly found myself with a week off, I jumped at the chance. I packed up my gear, tossed it into my old camper van, and set my sights on the Appalachians. The drive was breathtaking, winding roads that led me deeper into the mountains, the landscape changing with every turn. As the towns became fewer and further apart, I could feel the stress of my daily life fading away. This was exactly what I needed, complete isolation from the world. I had a rough idea of where I wanted to go, a secluded spot I had read about online. It was off the grid, promising peace and untouched nature. I turned onto a narrow, unmarked dirt road, leaving the last traces of civilization behind me. A surge of excitement coursed through me as I continued down the increasingly rough path, my van bumping over rocks and uneven ground. But I pushed on, determined to find the perfect camping spot. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the trees, I finally spotted it. A small clearing by a babbling stream, encircled by tall pines. I quickly set up camp, eager to settle in for the night. As darkness blanketed the forest, I sat by my campfire, taking in the sounds of the wilderness. The crackling flames, the soothing rush of the stream, the occasional owl hoot. It was perfect. I drifted off to sleep that night, feeling more at peace than I had in years. The next morning, I woke early, eager to explore the surroundings. I spent the day hiking, in awe of the untouched beauty around me. By late afternoon, worn out but content, I headed back to my campsite. That's when things began to go awry. As I neared my van, I noticed something was wrong. The door was slightly open, and I was sure I had locked it. My pulse quickened as I cautiously approached. Had an animal gotten inside? Or worse, another person? I peered inside, and my blood ran cold. The interior had been ransacked. My belongings were strewn about, and several items were missing, including my phone and car keys. Before I could process what this meant, I heard voices in the distance. Angry voices, getting closer. I ducked behind the van, trying to control my panicked breathing. I'm telling you, I saw smoke from a campfire round here yesterday. One voice said, "Gotta be one of them city folks trespassing again. Well, they picked the wrong mountain to mess with." Another replied, "Let's show them what happens to folks who don't respect private property." My mind raced. Private property. But this was public land, wasn't it? I'd researched it. I was sure. But as the voices got closer, I realized that my certainty didn't matter. These people believed I was trespassing, and they didn't sound like the type to listen to reason. I had seconds to make a decision. My van was useless without the keys, and I had no way to call for help. My only option was to run and hope I could lose them in the forest. I grabbed my backpack, thankful I'd left it outside the van, and took off into the woods as quietly as I could. Behind me, I heard shouts of discovery as they found my campsite. "Hey, there's someone here. Find them." The sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush spurred me on. I ran blindly, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and my pursuers as possible. As I ran, branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me at every step, but fear gave me speed and agility I didn't know I possessed. I could hear them behind me, their angry shouts echoing through the trees. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that desperate flight. But eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded, and I allowed myself to slow down. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like jelly. I collapsed behind a large fallen tree, trying to catch my breath and figure out what to do next. As my panic subsided, the reality of my situation sank in. I was lost in an unfamiliar forest, with no phone, no car, and no real supplies beyond what was in my small day pack. And somewhere out there, an unknown number of hostile locals were hunting for me. I took stock of what I had: a half-empty water bottle, a few granola bars, a small first aid kit, and a lighter. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As night fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. I was afraid to start a fire, worried it would give away my position. Instead, I huddled in the hollow of a large tree, shivering and jumping at every sound. The night seemed endless. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like approaching footsteps. I dozed fitfully, never fully falling asleep, always on high alert. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but alive. I knew I needed to find my way back to civilization, but I had no idea which direction to go. The sun was rising, so I knew east, but beyond that I was lost. I picked a direction and started walking, trying to be as quiet as possible. Every so often, I thought I heard voices in the distance, but I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my paranoia. As the day wore on, thirst became my biggest problem. I rationed my water carefully, but by afternoon the bottle was empty. I remembered from some long ago survival class that following a stream downhill often led to larger bodies of water and potentially to civilization. So when I came across a small creek, I decided to follow it. The going was tough. The terrain was rocky and steep, and I had to stop often to rest. But the fear of being found kept me moving. It was nearing sunset when I heard the unmistakable sound of voices again. This time, I was sure it wasn't my imagination. They were closer now, and there were more of them. I saw something move down by the creek. A voice called out, "Spread out. Don't let them get away." Panic surged through me. They were too close. I couldn't outrun them. Not in this terrain, not in my exhausted state. Desperate, I looked for somewhere to hide. That's when I spotted it. A small opening in the rocky hillside. A cave or at least a deep crevice. Without hesitation, I squeezed inside. The space was tight and pitch black. I could barely move, but I was hidden. I held my breath as I heard footsteps approaching. "You sure you saw something?" a voice said, so close it made me flinch. "I'm telling you, there was movement." Another replied, "Crafty son of a bitch must have found a hiding spot." They searched for what felt like hours. I remained frozen, hardly daring to breathe. My muscles cramped, and my throat burned with thirst, but I didn't dare move. Finally, as the light faded, I heard them moving away. "It's getting too dark. We'll pick up the search tomorrow." One of them said, "Ain't no way they're getting off this mountain without us knowing." I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore before allowing myself to relax slightly. But I knew I couldn't stay in the crevice. They'd be back at first light, and I needed to be far away by then. So I crawled out into the darkness and started moving. It was slow going, feeling my way in the dark, constantly afraid of making a noise that would give me away. But as the night wore on, I began to see lights in the distance. Civilization. Hope gave me a second wind. I pushed on, drawn to those distant lights like a moth to a flame. As the first light of day broke, I stumbled upon a paved road. An hour later, a car driven by an alarmed early commuter stopped and gave me a ride to the nearest police station. At first, the authorities were skeptical of my story. But once they checked the plates on my abandoned van and realized it was parked on private property, everything started to fall into place. It turned out the public land I had found online was outdated. The area had been sold years ago to a private owner, a reclusive family notorious for their hostility toward outsiders. In the end, I was fortunate. I received just a warning for trespassing, and the police managed to recover my van and belongings. But the ordeal left me deeply unsettled. I still love nature, still feel its pull. But now, I approach the wilderness with a much deeper respect and caution. I double-check my information, always letting someone know where I'm heading. And I never go into unfamiliar terrain alone. I learned the hard way that sometimes the greatest dangers in the wild aren't the animals or the weather. Sometimes it's the people you encounter, people who view you as a threat to their way of life. In those isolated spots, where the law feels far away and personal justice prevails, a simple misunderstanding can escalate into something deadly in an instant. The mountains still call to me, but now their whispers carry a warning. A reminder that the line between adventure and nightmare is razor thin, and it's all too easy to find yourself on the wrong side of it. The one and only time I went camping with my boyfriend, something completely crazy happened. It was a popular campsite, and there were a lot of people there when we arrived. It was in the middle of summer. At some point, we decided to go skinny dipping in the river that was just a short walk away, right after the sun had gone down. We made our way down to the river, and as we expected, nobody else was around. While we were in the water, just to remind you, we weren't wearing anything. A man suddenly appeared out of nowhere, standing on the sand and staring at us. I was terrified because he just stood there, not saying anything. My boyfriend asked him if everything was okay, and I could hear the fear in his voice. The man didn't respond and just started walking toward us, heading straight into the water. I can't even explain how surreal it was, like something straight out of a scary movie. We immediately started swimming across the river to the other side. We didn't want this creepy guy to get any closer. We made it to the other side, but when we looked back, he was much closer, still coming towards us. Naked and scared out of our minds, we ran into the trees and up toward the campsite on the other side of the river. Thankfully, it was really dark, and no one saw us. We ducked into a bathroom connected to the campsite and just stood there, shivering, trying to make sense of what just happened. After a while, we went back to the river, and when we looked, the man was gone. We swam back across, and when we reached the other side, we noticed that our clothes and phones were missing. We went back to the path that led to our tent, and by some miracle, no one had seen us. We got dressed and drove to the office to report that someone had stolen our stuff. But we had to lie and say it happened during the day because, obviously, skinny dipping wasn't allowed. We never saw our clothes or phones again. What the hell was that guy doing walking into the river toward us? Your guess is as good as mine. Hey everyone. So, I hopped into the Uber, and the driver had clearly been waiting for me. I barely had time to settle in before he started the engine, and that's when I froze. Across the parking lot, I saw a gray Volkswagen, parked directly opposite us. I couldn't say for sure if it was the same one from last night. I mean, for one, this one had a license plate, and I never got close enough to the previous car to check. Could very well have been a different car entirely. As we drove away, though, I looked up at the hotel, and I swear I saw a figure standing by one of the windows, staring out. I'm not jumping to conclusions yet. I'm not even sure it was the same room I was in. But at this point, I'm just second-guessing everything. Is this all just paranoia? Or is there actually something going on here? What if he really did track me down and I'm about to be hurt or worse? Or maybe this is all just a symptom of something like schizophrenia, and I'm just spiraling into fear. One thing I'm sure of though, that guy is still after me. Then I got a message from Nick, or Mr. Sullivan, whatever he calls himself these days. The text left me shaking. At exactly 8:34 p.m., he sent me a video, and the only words in the message were, "I see you." The video? I'm almost certain it's my house. And now all I can think about is when it was taken. It wasn't last night because the police were all around my place then. That means he must have filmed it either the first 2 nights or as recently as today. And I'm praying it's the latter. If it was today, it means he still thinks I'm at my house. But the guy isn't dumb. If he's figured out my garage code, he must have noticed I haven't been back. Either way, he's trying to mess with me, trying to force me out so he can catch me off guard. I almost expected worse, honestly. I don't know what this guy's deal is. Maybe he gets off on hurting animals or people. Maybe he enjoys watching his victims break down from all the fear. But what terrifies me most is if he somehow finds me at my friend's place. Tom, who's been keeping me safe, has taken on the responsibility of watching over me. If something happens to him because of me, I won't ever forgive myself. I offered him money, but he refused. For the last couple of hours, Tom and I have just been hanging out, drinking beer, and playing video games to help me relax. But Tom, well, he's a bit of a character. He's into dipping, loves sitting on his porch with a cold beer in hand, and has a pretty impressive gun collection. Honestly, he's probably the best person to have around in a situation like this, just like you all would probably be telling me to lean on him too. So, all things considered, I'm feeling the safest I have in days since all of this started. I also reported the situation to the police, showing them the video. They said they hadn't seen any car near my house at all in the last 24 hours. I gave them the license plate number, and they said they would do what they can to track its location. The night's getting late, so Tom and I agreed that we need to start locking things down just in case someone tries to break in. His house has security alarms, and he's on a fairly busy street, so anyone trying to park near his house would have to be in the driveway. He's also been avoiding any media attention, just like I asked, for my safety. The anxiety's still there, don't get me wrong, but having a friend here with me for the first time during all of this definitely helps. He even gave me one of his pistols, and we spent some time practicing at the shooting range in his backyard, even though neither of us have ever handled a gun before. Right now, we're just sitting on his porch, talking while I write this. I'm really thankful for the support you all have shown, and I'll keep you updated as always. Hopefully, tonight will be uneventful. Now, I guess we just wait. It was the summer right after I graduated from high school when a close friend and I decided to try our hand at camping. We both grew up in the greater Los Angeles area, so our understanding of the outdoors was limited to the couple of years we spent in Cub Scouts during elementary school. In other words, we were pretty much clueless. We packed up a tent, a couple of sleeping bags, and other basic supplies before heading out in his car. This was back in the 80s, before cell phones were common or any other portable digital devices existed. We drove north on Highway 395 for about 6 hours, then veered west into the mountains near Inyo Canyon. Our first mistake was not planning where we were going to camp. We just decided to wing it, thinking we could figure it out on the spot. The second mistake came when we left in the afternoon, so by the time we arrived in the general area, it was pitch black. We turned off the main road and onto a dirt path to search for a spot to set up. The dust from driving along the dirt road completely obscured the high beams of our headlights when we finally decided to stop and pitch camp. By then, it was around 11:30 p.m., and we were both exhausted and starving. At that point, we were willing to camp anywhere, mainly because we were so hungry and tired. The third mistake, we didn't bring flashlights. Our only source of light was Bic lighters for our cigarettes. We tried to set up the tent using the lighters in the dim light of the car, parked about 10 to 15 feet away. The wind was blowing, making it nearly impossible to keep the flame lit. Every few seconds, the lighter would go out either directly from the wind or because the flame was pushed into our thumbs. We were clearly out of our element. After finally getting the tent up, I was too tired to eat, but my friend managed to make some instant ramen. We smoked a cigarette in the car and then passed out in the tent. The next morning, we woke up to freezing cold temperatures, probably around 5:30 a.m. As soon as we stepped out of the tent, we realized that we had set up camp at the entrance of a hiking trail. We could see at least 2 no camping signs in the distance that we hadn't noticed in the dark. We quickly packed up the tent, cleaned up, and left. That morning, we ended up buying some inexpensive flashlights and a hot meal in a tiny town. It wasn't really a town, more like a few storefronts along a short stretch of road. We went into an office, though I don't recall exactly what it was. It might have been a park ranger station or the office for a campground. Regardless, we managed to find a campsite for the night. The campground was a large circle with campsites lining the outer edge, each about 50 yards apart. In the center was a shared bathroom and shower. We drove around the loop and saw one family all set up with a tent and camper. We found our spot, which was quite a distance from them, and set up camp. That night, my friend and I had our creepy encounter. We were lying in the tent, shining our flashlights upwards and chatting away. Eventually, our new flashlights died on us. Yes, they broke. Our fire pit was only about 6 feet from the tent's entrance, and it had reduced to nothing but a glowing ember. Looking back, we probably should have fully extinguished it, and we definitely shouldn't have set up the tent so close to it. But there we were, still talking and having a good time. My friend started to get distracted by something with his foot. After the 3rd or 4th time, he got up to check it out. I asked him what was wrong. He told me that something was tapping against his foot from the outside of the tent. His foot was pressed against the side of the tent, so from the outside, there must have been a noticeable bulge where his foot was. It sounded as if pebbles were being thrown at his foot through the fabric of the tent. There it was again. What the heck? Each time we heard a soft tap, almost like pebbles hitting the tent or a light knock. We tried to laugh it off, thinking it was just a twig or some grass moving in the wind, or maybe a loose strap on the outside of the tent. But at some point, we both fell silent at once. We heard something we both recognized. Footsteps. They were slowly moving toward the tent. We wondered if it was a bear or some other animal, but it sounded distinctly bipedal. The steps were slow and deliberate, with about 2 seconds between each one. Finally, I whispered, "Someone's out there." My friend stayed perfectly still, his face etched with fear. Then, suddenly my friend shot up, muttered, "F this," grabbed his pipe, packed it full, and took the deepest drag I've ever seen anyone take. About a minute or 2 later, he was out cold. Smoking wasn't my thing, so I was alone in the tent, wide awake. I was sitting up, clutching the only weapon I had, a Swiss Army pocket knife. I pulled out the large and small blades and the ice pick in the middle, holding them like some absurd melee weapon. Through the sheer nylon of the tent, I could barely make out the glowing embers of the fire pit and some of the rocks around it. I listened and watched, my heart racing. The footsteps continued, each one coming closer at the same slow pace. With every step, I could hear the crunching of dirt and gravel underfoot. It became clear to me that whoever was out there had positioned themselves between the tent and the fire pit, because the faint glow of the embers was now obscured by something outside the tent. The footsteps stopped right in front of the tent, about 6 to 8 inches from the entrance. For a full minute, it was dead silent. And then I heard a click. At that moment, I saw something through the nylon wall of the tent, a flashlight flicking on. I could clearly make out not just the light, but the outline of the hand holding it. The beam was aimed directly at the zipper entrance of the tent, just inches away. My blood ran cold, and my palms were instantly drenched in sweat. I yelled, "Who's there?" Though there was fear in my voice, I mostly sounded aggressive. Whoever it was immediately turned off their flashlight. I didn't move, and neither did they. The person stood there, right by the entrance to the tent. My friend, still out cold, had no idea what was happening. In a split-second decision, I decided to pretend like my friend was still awake. I whispered just loud enough for whoever was outside to hear. "Yeah, loaded. One in the chamber." It was as though I was trying to make it seem like my friend had asked about a weapon. The fourth mistake. We didn't have any real weapons for self-defense. It felt like an eternity, but after what seemed like at least 10 minutes, I finally heard the sound of footsteps slowly turning on the dirt and walking away from the tent. I stayed awake the entire night, and it wasn't until the first light of dawn filtered through the tent that I finally collapsed from exhaustion. The heat inside the tent woke us up, and by the time we got out, it was nearly noon. We went outside to inspect the area, but nothing seemed to be missing. However, we did find boot prints all over our campsite, leading away from it and out of the campground. That was the last time I ever camped in a tent. The first anonymous note was easy to brush off as a prank. The second, however, made my stomach twist with discomfort. By the third, as I read the chilling words, "Keep quiet or else," I realized that my involvement at the disaster relief site had put my life at risk. What had begun as a simple volunteer job had quickly spiraled into a nightmare of corruption and threats, and I was in far deeper than I ever expected. My name is Alex, and I never imagined I'd end up in the midst of a conspiracy. I'm just an ordinary person who wanted to help after a hurricane devastated our coast. The destruction was overwhelming. Homes were reduced to rubble, entire communities submerged, and thousands of people displaced. When the call for volunteers went out, I immediately signed up. The relief center was a whirlwind of activity from the moment I arrived. Trucks loaded with supplies kept coming in, and volunteers worked around the clock, sorting and distributing food, water, and other necessities. I threw myself into the work, grateful for the opportunity to make a difference. It wasn't until my second week that I first noticed something strange. I was helping to unload a truck of bottled water when I overheard two of the site managers arguing quietly. "The numbers don't add up," one of them muttered. "We're missing almost a third of what was supposed to be here." The other man grabbed his arm, glancing nervously around. "Keep your voice down. We'll deal with it later." They spotted me then and quickly separated, forcing smiles. I acted like I hadn't overheard anything, but the conversation stayed with me. Over the next few days, I became more observant. I saw inconsistencies between the supplies that were recorded as received and what actually made it to the distribution area. Expensive medical supplies would arrive, only to vanish before they could be handed out. Even some of the monetary donations seemed to be disappearing without a trace. At first, I tried to make sense of it. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe I just didn't understand how relief operations worked. But the more I saw, the more convinced I became that something was seriously wrong. So I decided to investigate. Late one night, after most of the other volunteers had left, I snuck into the main office. What I found there made my blood run cold. Behind a false panel in one of the filing cabinets was a ledger. It outlined hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of supplies and cash that had been stolen from the relief efforts. My hands trembled as I snapped photos of the ledger with my phone. I knew I had to report this, but to who? The local authorities were stretched thin dealing with the aftermath of the hurricane. And what if they were in on it too? I was so lost in thought that I almost didn't hear the footsteps approaching. I barely had time to replace the ledger and duck out of sight before the door opened. Through a crack in the cabinet I was hiding in, I saw two men enter, the site manager and someone I didn't recognize, dressed in an expensive suit that looked out of place in the relief center. "The boss isn't happy," suit guy said, his voice cold. "We're not meeting our quotas." The site manager wrung his hands nervously. "It's getting harder to hide the shortages. Some of the volunteers are asking questions." "Then get rid of them," suit guy snapped. "We can't afford any loose ends." They left shortly after, but I stayed hidden for what felt like hours. My heart pounding so loud I was sure someone would hear it. When I finally crept out of the office and back to my quarters, my mind was reeling. This was bigger than I had imagined, and far more dangerous. The next morning, I found the first note tucked under my door. "We know what you saw. Stay quiet and walk away." I crumpled it up, telling myself it was just a coincidence, a prank by one of the other volunteers. But then came the second note, this one pinned to my pillow. "Last warning. Forget what you found or suffer the consequences." The threat was clear, and fear coiled in my gut. They knew. Somehow, they knew I had been in that office. I wanted to leave, to run as far from this place as I could. But how could I abandon the people who genuinely needed help? And how could I live with myself if I let these criminals continue to steal from those who had already lost so much? I decided to gather more evidence. Using my phone, I secretly recorded conversations, took photos of suspicious shipments, and made copies of incriminating documents. All the while, I felt eyes on me watching my every move. The third note appeared in my bag during lunch. "Keep quiet or else." This time, it was accompanied by a photo of my family back home. The message was clear. They could get to me, and they could get to those I loved. That night, as I lay awake wrestling with what to do, I heard a commotion outside. Peering out my window, I saw several men loading boxes into an unmarked van. I recognized those boxes. They were supposed to contain vital medications for a nearby shelter. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and started recording. I had to get proof, something concrete I could take to the authorities. I crept outside using the shadows for cover as I tried to get a clearer shot. I was so focused on the men at the van that I didn't notice someone approaching from behind until it was too late. A hand clamped over my mouth, stifling my startled cry. "You should have listened to the warnings." A voice growled in my ear. I was dragged away from the scene, my heart racing as I realized this might be the end. They took me to a secluded area behind one of the storage tents. 3 men surrounded me, the site manager, suit guy from the office, and a burly man I'd seen working security. "We gave you every chance to walk away," suit guy said, his tone almost conversational. "But you just couldn't leave well enough alone. Could you? People are suffering." I spat back, finding a courage I didn't know I had. "You're stealing from those who have nothing left." The site manager at least had the decency to look ashamed, but suit guy just laughed. "It's business, kid. Nothing personal. But now, well, now it is personal." He nodded to the security guy, who cracked his knuckles ominously. I closed my eyes, bracing for the blow, but it never came. Instead, I heard shouts and the sound of running feet. I opened my eyes to see a group of people rushing towards us. Other volunteers, led by Sarah, one of the team leaders I'd grown close to over the past weeks. "Alex, are you okay?" Sarah called out as she reached us. She turned to suit guy, her eyes blazing. "We heard everything. It's over. The police are on their way." It turned out I wasn't the only one who had noticed something was wrong. Sarah and a few others had been conducting their own investigation. When they saw me being dragged away, they followed, recording everything on their phones. The next few hours were a blur of police statements and media cameras. The scale of the corruption was staggering. $1 million worth of aid had been stolen, not just from our site, but from relief efforts all along the coast. In the days that followed, as the story broke nationwide, I struggled with a mix of emotions. Relief that the truth was out, guilt that I hadn't acted sooner, fear of retaliation, but mostly, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I stayed on at the relief center, not only helping to rebuild the community but also trying to restore the trust that had been broken. It wasn't easy. Many people were angry, feeling betrayed by those who were supposed to assist them. But little by little, as genuine aid began to arrive and real progress was made, hope started to return. This experience taught me a great deal about the depths of human greed, yes, but also about the strength that comes from standing up for what's right, even when it's terrifying. I learned the value of trusting your instincts, of never being afraid to ask tough questions, and of how much of a difference a group of committed people can make when they come together for a common goal. Sometimes, late at night, I still catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadowy figure or find another ominous note. The fear may never fully fade, but I'm certain that I made the right choice. And if I had to do it all over again, even knowing the risks, I wouldn't change a thing. Because when faced with disaster, whether caused by nature or human corruption, staying silent is never the answer. It's up to each of us to speak out, to fight for what's right, and to lend a hand to those in need. That's the true meaning of disaster relief, and it's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. It was around December of 2013 when I was at university studying psychology. I was going through a rough patch with my OCD at the time, but I wasn't experiencing hallucinations or any psychotic symptoms. One of my best friends was studying the same course, and she would drive us both to and from university, which was about an hour's commute. It was near the end of the day, around December 2013, and I decided to use the toilet before heading home. We had just come out of a lecture, and the building was closing. All the other buildings were locked except for the main reception area, so I decided to use the toilet there. It was around 6 to 6:30 p.m., and the receptionist had already left for the day. A janitor would come to lock the building at around 6:30, so I went into the reception area and turned right toward the toilets. There was a heavy fire door, and as I walked down a long hallway, I noticed a classroom at the end that was locked and empty. On the right were offices, all dark and locked. I assumed. I have a genetic condition that affects my bones, so I've always used the disabled toilet. I tend to get anxious using the regular toilets, though I don't know why. When I tried to open the disabled toilet, it was locked. I assumed no one was in the men's toilets, so I decided to use that one instead. The building was practically closed, so I thought it was safe. I opened the door and saw a silver-haired man in a suit standing there, looking at himself in the mirror. I didn't feel scared, but as I took a step in, he turned to look at me and smiled. For some reason, I felt an urge to back out, so I started to close the door. He shouted "no" and moved toward the door. I quickly shut it and headed back out through the fire doors. That's when I noticed that the disabled toilet was now open, and no one had come out of it. The toilets were all very close to each other, and there's no way someone could have left that quickly. I went back into the men's toilet, feeling silly for backing out. When I opened the door, the man was gone. I looked around the toilet and even checked the cubicles. Nobody was there. I don't think I even used the toilet. I left through the fire doors and saw my friend sitting on some chairs. She had been waiting for me the whole time, so I asked her if she saw anyone come out of the toilets or leave the building. She said no, and I didn't want to seem crazy, so I didn't ask any follow-up questions. It would have been impossible for anyone to leave through any other exit. There was only one entrance, and my friend was sitting right by it. Anyway, it's now 3 a.m., and I've rambled enough, so I'm heading to bed. But if anyone has any idea what could have happened, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Dusk settles in, and the salty water laps gently at my feet, causing them to sink slightly into the shore with each wave. The ocean sounds fill my ears, soothing and constant. If I could see myself from the outside, I imagined my eyes would be rolling back, eventually closing in complete contentment. Peace. In love with the ambience. Are there sharks in that water, Mom? I ask, my curiosity piqued. With a sigh, she responds, No, son, that's a lake. Lakes have fresh water. Sharks can't swim in fresh water. I must have asked her that question every single time we crossed the Mackinac Bridge, the one that spans the gap between Michigan's upper and lower peninsulas and separates Lake Michigan from Lake Huron. In my young mind, all I could think about were the monsters lurking in the dark waters. But my mother, God bless her patience, always reassured me there were no sharks or other creatures in the lake. Years later, now an adult, doing all the adult things like wiping my own butt, I came across a headline on a news site that made me laugh out loud. But let me provide some context. I've traded the cold lake life for the salt life, nearly 2,000 miles from my childhood home. Now, I live on the West Coast, where I can wake up to temperatures in the 70s even in late December. The smells and sounds of the ocean are with me every day, so different from the bitterly cold, sub-zero days of my childhood, where the cold was your only greeting. Despite the change, I still keep up with the local news back home. I check the Detroit Free Press once a week, and as a result, I get recommended stories in my feed. That headline I mentioned earlier, bull shark found in remote Michigan lake. Well. I thought to myself after reading further. Apparently, while rare, there have been a few bull shark sightings in the Great Lakes over the past 2 decades. These sharks are so tough and adaptable that they can survive not only in brackish water but in full-on freshwater. It's rare but not impossible. I didn't laugh out loud anymore, just quietly to myself. I don't think my mom had intentionally kept this information from me. She probably didn't know, or maybe she just didn't care. But in that moment, I felt vindicated. Sharks could have been in those lakes. One word lingered in my mind: adaptable. The will to not just live, but to survive is truly remarkable. These sharks didn't just exist in the water that shifted from salt to fresh. They fought. I paused, took a sip of my cold brewed coffee, and gazed out at the ocean. The crashing waves always brought me peace, always brought me back to reality. The ocean is undeniably a dangerous place. I never doubted that. I never doubted the existence of dangerous creatures lurking beneath the surface. What I never doubted was the resilience of life. Squinting, I tried to focus on a cove in the distance, barely visible from where I stood. Normally, you'd need binoculars to spot it, but today the smog and weather had aligned to give me a rare, clear view. The cove must be over 10 miles away, and I could see something there. A woman? No, stop. That's not possible. It wasn't an island, just a few rocks scattered in the cove. No one kayaked out there. It's much too dangerous, and there's nowhere to stop. You didn't just lay on the rocks out there, but I could see her. Red hair, white skin. That's really all I could see. She appeared to be sitting on the rock. Facing away from me, I could see long red hair cascading from her head down to the rock, maybe 3 or 4 feet long. Her arms, white and strong, were propping her body up, fingers spread. Her legs, those I couldn't see until they came into view, moving up and down in front of her, just barely peeking from in front of her back. Her legs were not white like her arms. They were green? No, dark. She must have been wearing pants. Maybe I should be calling the authorities. She has to be marooned out there. I threw my coffee into the sink and made my way to my cell phone. Before I could punch the first of 3 emergency numbers in, a cooing sound as sweet as a Sunday psalm was echoing in my head. There were no words, but I could hear the familiar melody of Hallelujah being pounded out slow and mesmerizing. I dropped the phone. The phone smacking the wood floor snapped me out of my altered state. I looked at my computer, seeing the article about bull sharks somehow making their way into the Great Lakes. The beasts found their way into a place where they don't belong, seemingly to eat and survive as they would in their natural habitat. It's not like you don't eat if you're on vacation, right? Even though you are not in your home, you still need to survive. Focused on sharks again, I sharply moved my neck towards the ocean. I completely forgot about the woman I just saw sitting out in the middle of the sea. The fog has crept in now. This doesn't make sense, but I think a few hours have passed. The horizon has subtly faded into the water. It was daylight when I saw her. Now dusk has appeared. Somehow I can still see. I can see that she is gone. A huge sigh escapes me. A sigh my mother made every time I asked the stupid questions about sharks being in freshwater lakes. My sigh, though, was in relief. She was not there. Therefore, I had too much cold brew that was playing too many tricks on my overactive imagination. She looked real, though, even from miles away. I could see that blood-red hair, her arms propping her slight frame up, her scaly green legs flipping in front of her. Wait, what the heck? That did not happen, and I did not see that. She had legs. They were just in pants. A casual paddle boarder or kayaker that knew the rock was a safe place to take a break. I felt a pull. Something not of our physical world. A beckoning. This is just too much. I took one more look into the ocean, again confirming that there was nothing there, and that nothing weird was happening. I looked again toward my computer, and it was turned off. I nearly tripped over my dining room chairs at the sound. My phone. I hadn't picked it up from the ground. I slowly extended my arm to pick up my face-down cellular device. As I lifted it up from the ground, I can already see the illumination reflect of the ground from its screen, indicating that I have a message. Wonder who it's from. Come outside. Those two words strike me through the collarbone like a harpoon. Holding the phone in my hand, I move my eyes from left to right, making carefully sure not to move my head. Something is here watching me. Everyone knows the feeling. The sound of the ocean, again, brings me back to the real world. As real as it can get, I suppose. A cool breeze blankets me. I usually don't feel that this time of the year, as I keep all doors and windows closed because of the heat. I'd only get that ocean breeze if I opened. My sliding door leading to the porch is open. The wooden deck? Damp, like someone just ran across it. Now I was upset, not wholly realizing that I had a likely intruder attempting to enter my home. I ran outside. Who are you? I yelled, like that I was going to gain anything. Another strong wind hit my face. I turned to the side, struck by a scent that almost debilitated me. As I turned my eyes to my deck, a starfish looked back up at me. Another animal that can survive in rather harsh conditions. I scanned the horizon, now as dark as madness. The only light is coming from downtown, nearly 5 miles away. There's little in the way of street lights in this area. Something about these lights being constructed in the 50s, and they still have not replaced them with newer LED styles. I can see 1 or 2 ships out there, peppered with safety lights, and then one more ball of white where I saw her before. Somehow I could see her clearly. Even though she should be more than 16 kilometers away, her hair was indeed red, just like her aura. Her green eyes pierced my soul. Her perfect teeth bared from behind her perfect flesh-colored lips. I realize that doesn't sound appetizing, but believe me, it is. She doesn't wear clothes, but her hair covers her completely. She looks both amazing and regal. Her leg, calm down. Come closer. You know, everything you've been missing is out there. What? How? I can't get out there. I don't have... What's it called? A thing to get me there. Sully, I think you mean a boat. It's okay, you don't need one. You will adapt. If you want something badly enough, you'll survive. Why does that sound so familiar? How is there a woman out in the middle of the water? She must have come for a reason. Maybe I'm supposed to be out there too. I've always loved the water. Fresh, salt, brackish, everything in between. Her song fills every corner of my mind, haunting and beautiful. I'm no longer in control of my body. My feet begin moving toward the shoreline, like they've known what to do all along. I should have done this a long time ago. Dusk. The salty water laps gently against my feet. With each wave, they sink a little deeper into the shore. The sounds of the ocean rush into my ears. If I could see myself from a third-person perspective, I imagine my eyes would be rolling back before they finally closed. Peace. In love with the ambience, I take my first step into the ocean. When I was a young boy, I always had trouble falling asleep at night. My mind would race with anxiety, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't calm down enough to sleep. It would get so bad that I would end up carrying my pillow and blanket around the house, trying to find a better spot to sleep, sometimes in the living room or even on the floor of my parents' bedroom. Looking back, it's pretty embarrassing, but there's a reason I mention it. Every so often, my younger brother and I would stay at my Nana's house. It was a 3-story duplex in one of those gated senior communities that seem to pop up in residential areas near hospitals. When I was 8, my grandfather passed away from cancer at the hospital just around the corner. After that, my Nana lived alone. Despite that, I remember enjoying my time at her house, eating lots of food, playing video games, and watching VHS tapes of alien encounters and ghost stories. That was my idea of a thrill. Despite all this, I've always considered myself skeptical of the paranormal. However, something happened during one of those nights at my Nana's house that I still can't explain, even over a decade later. This particular night, I was the only one staying at my Nana's house. The upstairs of her duplex had 2 bedrooms, a large master bedroom and a smaller bedroom across the hallway. Most nights, my brother and I would sleep in the smaller room, but there was always something a little off about it. On this night, I decided I wouldn't sleep in that room alone. Instead, I grabbed a pillow and blanket and settled on the floor in my Nana's master bedroom. My family was used to my strange sleeping habits, so they didn't mind. I set up my makeshift bed between the door and the queen-size bed where my Nana slept and quickly fell asleep. But in the middle of the night, I woke up, tossing and turning. It must have been very early in the morning. The room was completely dark. To my right was the large bed where my Nana lay, still sleeping. To my left is the bedroom door, left ajar only slightly. I can hear my Nana sleeping in her bed, the soft inhale and exhale of someone in a deep sleep, and then a troubling realization takes hold of me. I notice that hers isn't the only pattern of breathing that I can hear. To my left, in the direction of the hallway and the room directly across the hall, I can hear a completely separate inhale and exhale. It sounded as though someone was standing right outside the bedroom door, breathing loudly. I can remember thinking to myself, am I just imagining this or am I hearing myself? I remember holding my breath and listening and then guaranteed myself that I was hearing 2 different people breathing. It was easy to tell because the breathing sounds were on opposite sides of me. It continued for at least a full minute, and the more I paid attention to it, the more terrified I became. In the moment, I pulled my blanket over my head and convinced myself that maybe for some reason, one of my other relatives had shown up and needed to crash in her guest bedroom. Somehow, I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, sitting down at a stack of pancakes, I asked my Nana if anyone had been over last night. She told me no and asked me why I asked, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I had experienced the night before. Being in a gated community, she would have had to buzz through any visitors that arrived. That's the one and only time I've ever experienced something that I just cannot explain. It was a snowy night when I pulled into the parking lot of the gas station. I worked the overnight shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. and had been there for several months. I really didn't enjoy the job, but finding another one was tough, and with how things were going in other areas of my life, the night shift fit better into my schedule. Still, every night I dragged myself in, exhausted, and struggled to get through each shift. I parked next to the only other car in the lot, my coworker's, and headed inside to relieve him. He left just a few minutes later, leaving me alone for the rest of the night. My manager had left a note on the desk with a few tasks, but from what I could tell, they didn't look like much. I figured it would only take about an hour to get everything done. So, I procrastinated as long as I could, hoping to avoid the sleepiness that always hit once the exhaustion set in. I was sitting behind the desk when, around midnight, I noticed a car pulling into the station. I glanced out the window and saw an old SUV parked by one of the pumps. With the snowstorm outside, not many people were on the road, but occasional customers were normal. I went back to scrolling through videos on my phone, not paying much attention, but after about 10 minutes, I looked up again and saw the SUV was still there. The headlights were off and the doors were closed. It looked like they should be pumping gas, but the car had been sitting there for too long. I stood up and moved closer to the window, scanning the area around the station, but there was no sign of anyone. If they had been sitting in the car for the last 10 minutes with it off, they'd have to be freezing. It was cold, windy, and snowy outside, so I started to get worried about them. I kept an eye on the SUV for a few more minutes, hoping to see any movement or someone getting back in, but nothing happened. It felt like the car had been abandoned right next to the pump. After a moment of hesitation, I threw on my jacket and went outside. As soon as I stepped into the cold, I knew I was right. No one would be outside for long in this weather without their car running. I hurried over to the SUV, looking around, then pressed my face to the window to try and see inside. "Hello? Anyone in there? Just checking to see if you're okay." I called out, but I couldn't see anyone in the car. It was hard to tell for sure, but I was pretty confident there was no one there. Now even more confused, I backed up and glanced around the empty parking lot before I started walking back toward the building. With my attention no longer focused on the car, I looked down at the ground and noticed some shoe prints in the snow. They led toward the side of the building, not directly in front, but to the side. Looking back, I saw that the tracks seemed to come from the SUV. By this point, though, I was freezing and didn't want to investigate further without warming up first. I went inside and turned on the small heater by the counter, holding my hands in front of it to warm up. I was only inside for about 30 seconds to a minute when a loud thump echoed through the building from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing to see. I walked around the counter and headed toward the back. On the floor, I noticed puddles of dirty water, probably from snow melting off someone's boots. A chill ran through me as I stepped closer to the back room, turning the corner toward the supply room. That's when I saw it. There, standing in the dark behind one of the shelves, was the outline of a figure. They were tall with broad shoulders, a large scruffy beard, and they were staring right at me. My heart stopped for a second, but after the initial shock, my reaction was to slowly walk back to the counter. I don't know why I did that. Maybe I was just too stunned to act. I stood there, staring at the doorway to the supply room, unsure of how long I was frozen in place. Finally, I quietly grabbed the store phone and called the police, whispering for help. Then came the most terrifying 10 minutes of my life as I waited in silence. During that time, I didn't hear anything from the supply room, which only made things worse. For some reason, the man never came out. When 2 police officers arrived, I quietly told them where to look. They searched the room while I stayed by the front. To my shock, when they came out, they had found no one. The man was gone. Watery shoe prints were left near the back door, but outside, there were fresh tracks in the snow that led directly into the dark, empty field beyond the gas station. The field stretched for miles. Obviously, they couldn't search it that night, and when they went back in the following days, they found nothing. The field was so vast that the man could have gone anywhere, but the cold and wind that night made me think they would find something or someone. The SUV was taken in, hoping it might hold some clue, but for some reason, they couldn't trace any ownership records. So we were left with just the events of that night. Who the man was, what he wanted, and where he is now remains a mystery. The moment I saw the empty sleeping bag where Jake should have been, I knew our camping trip had taken a terrifying turn. The morning mist hung thick in the air, blurring the edges of our campsite, but there was no mistaking the fact that one of us was missing. And as I stood there, heart racing, I couldn't shake the feeling that the strange lights we'd seen in the sky the night before had something to do with it. It was supposed to be a fun adventure, just 4 friends looking for a thrill in the wilderness. We'd heard the stories about this area, whispered tales of UFO sightings, strange lights in the sky, and campers who claimed they'd lost time. But we hadn't really believed it, or at least I hadn't. It was just part of the excitement, wasn't it? Now, as I stared at Jake's abandoned sleeping bag, I wasn't so sure anymore. "Guys, wake up," I hissed, shaking Sarah and Mike awake. "Jake's gone." Sarah shot upright, her eyes wide with panic. "What do you mean, gone?" Mike was slower to wake, mumbling as he unzipped his sleeping bag. He probably just went to take a leak. Chill out. But as we called out for Jake, our voices echoed through the misty forest, and an eerie silence was our only answer. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled, just an unnatural, oppressive quiet that sent shivers down my spine. We searched the immediate area around our campsite, but there was no sign of Jake. No footprints leading away, no discarded clothing, nothing. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. "This isn't funny, Jake," Sarah shouted, her voice trembling with fear. "Come out now." But deep down, we all knew this wasn't some elaborate prank. Something was horribly wrong. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, we expanded our search. We combed the surrounding forest, shouting Jake's name until our voices grew hoarse. But with each passing hour, our hope dwindled. By mid-afternoon, things started to get even stranger. I was pushing through a dense patch of underbrush when suddenly, everything around me seemed to flicker. For a brief moment, everything changed. The trees were taller, older. The ground was covered in iridescent moss, and the sky had turned a deep, unnatural purple. I blinked, and everything snapped back to normal. But the vision was seared into my mind, leaving me dizzy and disoriented. Did you guys see that?" I asked, my voice shaky. Sarah and Mike exchanged confused looks. "See what?" Mike asked. I tried to explain, but the words felt absurd, even to me. They exchanged worried glances, clearly thinking I was losing it. But I knew what I had seen, and I had a growing sense that it was somehow tied to Jake's disappearance. As the day dragged on, similar incidents started happening to all of us. Sarah swore she saw strange symbols carved into tree trunks, only for them to vanish when she looked back. Mike kept hearing whispers in a language he couldn't understand, always just at the edge of his hearing. And for me, I kept experiencing those flashes, those moments where reality seemed to shift. Each time, the alternate world I glimpsed became clearer, more vivid. And each time, I felt a pull as if something was trying to draw me in. Night fell, and we were no closer to finding Jake. Exhausted and terrified, we made our way back to the campsite. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were lost. The forest around us seemed different, unfamiliar. Had we wandered farther than we thought, or was something else at play? We huddled around the campfire, jumping at every snapping twig and rustling leaf. The sky above was clear, the stars impossibly bright. But as we watched, the stars began to move slowly at first, then faster, swirling in impossible patterns. "This can't be happening," Sarah whispered, clutching my arms so tight it hurt. "What's going on?" Before I could answer, a blinding light flooded our campsite. It was so bright, so all-encompassing that for a moment, I thought I'd gone blind. I could hear Sarah and Mike screaming, but their voices sounded distant, muffled. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light was gone. But we weren't in our campsite anymore. We were somewhere else. The air was thick and heavy, filled with a strange sweet scent that made my head spin. The ground beneath our feet pulsed with an otherworldly energy, and all around us, tall, spindly figures moved in the shadows, their movements fluid and unnatural. "Welcome," a voice echoed in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. "We've been waiting for you." One of the figures stepped forward, and I felt my heart stop. It was Jake, but not Jake. His eyes were too large, his skin pale and translucent. When he smiled, his teeth were sharp and numerous. "Don't be afraid." "Not Jake," said his voice, an unsettling mix of familiar and alien. "You're home now." I wanted to run, to scream, to wake up from this nightmare, but I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, unresponsive. And as I stood there paralyzed, I realized with growing horror that this was real. We hadn't just stumbled upon a UFO hotspot. We'd walked right into a trap. The creatures, for I couldn't think of them as anything else, moved closer, their long fingers reaching out to touch us. Each touch sent jolts of electricity through my body, and with each jolt, I felt myself changing. My perception shifted. My thoughts became clouded. I could see the same thing happening to Sarah and Mike. Their features were subtly altering, becoming more like Jake's, more like the creatures around us. And the worst part, a small growing part of me was beginning to think that this was right, that we belonged here. Time lost all meaning. Could have been hours or days or years that we stood there, being remade by these alien touches. Memories of our old lives began to fade, replaced by new ones. Memories of a world with purple skies and pulsing ground, of ships that sailed between the stars. But just as I was about to lose myself completely, a small part of my mind rebelled. This wasn't right. This wasn't our world. We didn't belong here. With every ounce of willpower I had left, I fought against the alien influence. I clung to memories of home, of my family, of who I really was, and slowly, painfully, I began to break free. No, I shouted, my voice sounding strange and distorted. This isn't real. Sarah, Mike, Jake, we have to get out of here. My words seemed to break whatever spell had been cast over us. Sarah and Mike's eyes cleared, confusion and fear replacing the placid acceptance that had been there moments before. Even Jake seemed to falter, a flicker of recognition passing over his alien features. The creatures hissed, their form shifting and writhing in anger. The world around us began to destabilize, reality bending and warping like a funhouse mirror. I grabbed Sarah and Mike's hands, reaching out to Jake with my free hand. Come on, I yelled. We're going home. For a moment, Jake hesitated. Then, with a look of desperate hope, he grabbed my hand. The moment our fingers touched, there was a flash of blinding light, a sensation of falling, and then we were back in our campsite, the normal Earth campsite. The sun was just beginning to rise, birds were chirping, and a soft breeze rustled through the trees. It was as if nothing had happened. But we knew better. The memories of our ordeal were already starting to blur, fading like a dream when you wake up. But the fear, that lingering sense of wrongness, remained. As we exchanged glances, the haunted look in each of our eyes spoke volumes. We all knew that none of us would ever be the same. We packed up camp in silence, eager to put as much distance as we could between us and this place. As we hiked back to our car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that just beyond the veil of our reality, those creatures were waiting for another chance to pull us back. We never spoke of what happened that night. How could we? Who would believe us? But sometimes, when I look up at the night sky, I swear I can see the stars shifting in those impossible patterns. And with a strange, unsettling mix of fear and longing, I wonder if they'll ever come back for us. Because the truth is, a small part of me, the part one try to push away, hopes they will. I had never heard of Black Hollow before. It wasn't on any maps, and the road leading to it was barely a path. Cracked asphalt swallowed by the surrounding forest. I was only passing through, trying to find a shortcut on my way to visit an old friend. But when I saw the rusted sign leaning at an awkward angle on the roadside, something made me stop. Welcome to Black Hollow. Population 172. I should have kept driving. The road wound deeper into the woods, and after a few miles, the trees gave way to the town. At first glance, it seemed abandoned. The houses were old, leaning under the weight of time, their windows dark and empty. There were no cars on the streets, no people walking about. Just silence. Too much silence. I pulled into what looked like the town square. A diner stood at the corner, its neon sign long dead, the door slightly ajar. Across from it, a general store's display window was cracked but intact. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Then I saw them, people, but they weren't moving. A dozen figures stood along the sidewalks, facing the street, their eyes blank, their expressions frozen. Men, women, even children, all eerily still, their faces drained of color. At first, I thought they were mannequins posed and forgotten. Then one of them blinked. I gripped the steering wheel, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but something held me there, a mix of fear and curiosity rooting me in place. My pulse hammered in my ears as I slowly opened the car door, stepping onto the cracked pavement. "Hello!" My voice felt too loud in the stillness. No one answered. No one moved. I took a hesitant step forward. The nearest figure was an old man, his clothes neat but dusty, his eyes vacant. His lips were slightly parted, as if he had been about to speak but never got the chance. And then, from somewhere deep in the town, a bell rang. A deep, echoing chime that sent a shiver down my spine. In unison, the figures turned toward me. Not just their heads. Their whole bodies twisted unnaturally, bones cracking as they shifted. Their vacant eyes locked onto mine, their mouths opening in soundless horror. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I sprinted to my car, throwing myself inside, fumbling with the keys. As the engine roared to life, they began to move. Not running, not walking, gliding. Their feet never touched the ground as they floated toward me, their hands reaching, their faces still frozen in that eerie, open-mouthed expression. I hit the gas. The tires screamed against the pavement as I sped back the way I came, the town shrinking in my rearview mirror. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, until the trees swallowed the last glimpse of Black Hollow. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't know why that town existed, or why it had been waiting for me. But I do know this. When I finally dared to check my GPS, there was no record of a town called Black Hollow. And when I looked back at the road, the rusted sign was gone. In the mid-1980s, I was on a 41-foot sailboat in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay with about 7 other men. We were doing a shakedown test cruise, planned to be out for about 12 hours. The weather forecast wasn't as reliable back then, and we got caught in a tropical storm, with winds gusting into the 50 miles per hour range, just short of a weak hurricane. We had just barely rigged storm sails and safety measures because one of the guys, who was the best sailor on board, had sensed the storm was coming. If it weren't for him, we probably would have died. During the storm itself, I thought I was going to die at any moment. In fact, we made a secure call on the radio, which sailors know well if they've been out at sea. If not, it's not that important. For what felt like 15 minutes, we were caught in a maelstrom with no visibility. But then it passed and we were safe. It was about 3 p.m., and while the sky was still covered with clouds, the ambient light allowed us to see about 2 miles in any direction. If you're familiar with the sea, you know that such storms, especially in shallower areas near land, stir up a lot of seafloor debris. The bay around us was choppy and foamy. We were all on deck, working lines and checking for damage. That's when I saw something about 15 feet off the starboard side. Something swam up to the surface, broke through, looked at us, then submerged again. It looked like a thin, humanoid figure, with arms like a man's and a human head, but its skin was covered in scales like a snake. It blinked at us with strange, heavy-lidded eyes before diving back down. Now, let me clarify a few things. I wasn't on drugs or alcohol, and I had no injuries. I was just elated to be alive, and my senses were sharp, not dulled. With about 6 years of experience on ships and fishing boats, I had seen plenty of marine life: squid, octopi, sharks, flying fish, and more. I wasn't the kind of guy to mistake seaweed for a sea monster. I made a quick decision not to say anything. What could I say? I just saw something weird. Take my word for it? The men on this boat were all professionals: mechanics, engineers, sailors. There was no reason to make a scene, especially when we were all working towards D, skipper, or OD qualifications. So I stayed quiet. Then, out of nowhere, one of the other sailors, a USN captain with over 30 years of experience, piped up and said, "I just saw a brown thing pop up on the surface. It looked like a lizard man with a scaly face. It blinked at us with these big eyes, then went back under." "Yeah, I saw it too," I said, and that was it. No one else mentioned it. Later that day, we sailed back to the pier, and it was never spoken of again. You ever get that unsettling feeling that something isn't right? even though everything around you appears perfectly normal? It's like a creeping sensation that starts in your stomach and slowly climbs up to your throat. An inexplicable unease that you can't quite shake. That's how I felt on the first night aboard the cruise ship. It should have been the most relaxing vacation of my life. Just me and my husband, Tim, enjoying 10 days at sea, surrounded by nothing but blue skies and calm waters. But almost as soon as we set sail, something felt off. It was subtle at first. Little things. The air in the hallways felt stale, even though we were out in the open ocean. The lights flickered when we passed certain parts of the ship. The hum of machinery never seemed to stop, and while most of the passengers seemed perfectly fine, laughing and lounging by the pool, there were a few who, well, their behavior didn't sit right with me. It was our second night on board when things really started to feel strange. Tim and I had just finished dinner in the main dining hall and were walking back to our cabin. The halls were quiet, except for the faint sound of music drifting from the ballroom, where some formal event was taking place. Tim joked about how we should crash it, but my mind was elsewhere. Something was bothering me, though I couldn't figure out what. That's when I first saw her. An older woman, maybe in her late 70s, sitting alone at a small table by one of the windows, staring out at the dark ocean. She wasn't dressed for dinner like the rest of us, just a plain, old-fashioned dress, the kind you'd wear to a casual gathering. Her face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and her eyes seemed distant, like she wasn't really present. I nudged Tim and nodded toward her. "Do you see her?" I asked. He glanced over and shrugged. "Yeah, probably just a widow or something. Cruises attract all kinds of people, as you know." But something about her didn't sit right. She didn't move, didn't react to anything around her. She just sat there, staring out at the water like she was waiting for something. I couldn't shake the feeling, even after we got back to our cabin. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans of the ship as it moved through the water. Tim fell asleep right away, but I couldn't stop thinking about that woman. Why was she sitting there alone? Why hadn't she looked up when we passed? The next day, we decided to explore more of the ship. It was massive, almost like a floating city with shops, restaurants, and even a small theater. We spent the day lounging by the pool, sipping cocktails, and soaking up the sun. By the time the evening rolled around, I'd almost forgotten about the woman. Almost later that night, we found ourselves in the same hallway as before, making our way back to the cabin after another late dinner. I glanced over at the spot by the window, half expecting the woman to be gone, but she wasn't. She was still sitting there in the same exact spot, staring out at the ocean like she hadn't moved in 24 hours. The same pale dress, the same distant look in her eyes. I stopped walking, my stomach turning with unease. "Tim, she's there again." He followed my gaze and frowned. "Weird? Think she's okay?" "I don't know." I felt a chill run down my spine. It's like she hasn't moved at all. Tim shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe she's just lonely. Do you want to check on her?" I hesitated, torn between my growing sense of dread and the nagging feeling that I should do something. Before I could make up my mind, a member of the ship's crew appeared from around the corner, walking briskly toward us. He was a young guy, probably in his mid-20s, with a neat uniform and a polite smile plastered on his face. "Is everything all right?" he asked, looking between us. I pointed to the woman. "We've seen her sitting there 2 nights in a row. She hasn't moved. Is she okay?" The crew member's smile faltered for a split second, just enough for me to notice. He glanced over at the woman, then quickly turned back to us, his face composed again. "Oh, I'm sure she's fine. Some passengers enjoy spending their time in the quiet areas of the ship." I wasn't convinced. "She looks like she's been sitting there for a long time." The crew member's smile grew tighter. "I'll make sure someone checks on her, but I wouldn't worry. Enjoy the rest of your evening." With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Tim and me standing there, feeling more unsettled than before. "I don't like this," I muttered as we continued down the hallway. "Something's not right." Tim sighed, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "You're probably overthinking it. Let's just get some sleep." But sleep didn't come easy that night. I kept replaying the scene in my head. The woman's blank stare, the crew member's strained smile. Something wasn't adding up. The next day, I couldn't help myself. I started asking around, casually bringing up the old woman in conversations with other passengers. Most of them hadn't noticed her, but one couple, a pair of retirees from Florida, seemed to know what I was talking about. "Oh, you mean the lady in the window seat?" the woman said, her face lighting up. "We've seen her a few times. Strange, isn't it? She never seems to leave that spot. Do you know who she is?" I asked, feeling a mix of relief and curiosity. The couple exchanged a glance, and the man shrugged. "We asked one of the crew members about her yesterday. He said there's no one registered on the ship that fits her description." I blinked. "What? That's what he said," the woman added, her voice lowering as if she were sharing a secret. "No one matching her age or appearance is on the passenger list, but we've seen her just like you. So who knows?" That sent a chill through me. If she wasn't a registered passenger, then who was she? And why hadn't anyone from the crew seemed concerned? That night, I couldn't resist. After dinner, I dragged Tim back to the same spot by the window, and sure enough, she was there again, sitting in the same position, staring out at the dark waves. "Okay, this is getting creepy," Tim muttered, glancing around as if hoping someone else would confirm what we were seeing. But the hallway was empty, just us and her. "Let's go," I whispered, suddenly feeling the weight of the silence around us. "This isn't right." We turned to leave, but just as we were about to step away, I heard something. A faint whisper, barely audible over the hum of the ship. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Tim shook his head. "Hear what?" I strained my ears, listening. For a moment, there was only silence. But then, I heard it again, soft, like a breath on the wind. "Help!" I whipped around, my eyes locking onto the woman. Her head hadn't moved, but her lips were moving, just barely. The same vacant stare, the same pale face. But now her mouth was forming words. "Help me." I grabbed Tim's arm, my body shaking uncontrollably. "She's saying something." He stepped back, his face going pale. "We need to get out of here." We practically ran back to our cabin, slamming the door behind us. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was she? Why was she asking for help? And why was the crew acting like she didn't exist? The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the front desk and demanded to speak with someone in charge. After some back and forth, they finally agreed to send a senior crew member to meet with me. When he arrived, I told him everything, the woman, the strange behavior, the whispers. He listened quietly, nodding occasionally, but when I finished, his face remained unreadable. "I understand your concern," he said, his voice calm, "but I assure you, there's no one on this ship fitting that description." I stared at him in disbelief. "But we've seen her, multiple times. Other passengers have seen her too," I said. He remained unmoved. Sometimes the mind can play tricks, especially in unfamiliar environments. "I suggest you try to enjoy the rest of your trip." I left the meeting feeling more confused than ever. I knew what I'd seen. I knew she was real. But if no one would acknowledge her existence, what could I do? A few days later, we disembarked, and I never saw the woman again. But even now, as I sit here recalling the events of that trip, I can't shake the feeling that I left something or someone behind. And I still wonder what would have happened if I had listened to her plea for help.